was not a myth, was not an accident. They've been here before, they will be here again. Society of the Ancients, believe they are real.
In 1995, small business owner Dave George was invited by his neighbour Aaron Elliott to a backyard barbecue. Conversation was mundane for a while, but the more beers they got down, the more abstract it became. Eventually though, talk turned to a book series that Aaron was reading that dealt with ancient unsolved mysteries. It was a book that was peddled in late-night infomercials, but regardless, had garnered a cult following. After a long 2-hour discussion, and a brief foray into Aaron's duplex to find said mysterious book, Dave found himself enthralled with these ancient mysteries, specifically with their possible relationship to extraterrestrials. And thus, the snowball began to roll. Not long after, Dave became engrossed in research regarding the Ancients, an ancient advanced alien species who he believed were responsible for humanity's historical anomalies. Books, video, radio, he scoured every medium imaginable to uncover more, and in that very same year, founded the Society of the Ancients in the pursuit of their discovery. Through his research, he came across a quote from the former Apollo 14 astronaut Edgar Dean Mitchell, the 6th man to ever walk on the moon. I have been, over the years, very skeptical, like many others, about extraterrestrial existence, but in the last 10 years or so, I've come to realise that the evidence is building up to make this a valid and researchable question. These words had a significant impact on Mr. George, and years later, having constructed his secret society with hundreds of members spanning the entire globe, he would look back on them and think about the moment that it all began. The Society of the Ancients, founded by Dave George and currently chairmaned by Aaron Elliott, is not a cult. It is not an anti-government group, not a quackpot religious commune, nor a sci-fi reader's circle. The purpose of the society is to collect and share information that has led its members to a unique understanding about human history, and more so, its relationship to a gracious and technically advanced ancient alien race who have been in contact with us since the Stone Age. The forerunners to humanity's existence. The society is comprised of 510 lawyers, architects, teachers, business owners, artists, researchers, authors, videographers, and many more occupations. They are a society of intelligent and accomplished people with one unified goal: sifting through vast archives of knowledge, history, and discrepancies within the two to explain the unexplainable, to uncover the truth of those who came before us and how they influence humanity's advancement as a species. Now, allow me to break the fourth wall for a moment and add a little bit of context. So, who actually are the Society of the Ancients? Well, they were an integral part of Halo 3's marketing ARG, Iris. Bungie created the Society of the Ancients as a way to tie Halo's lore in with our real world and use the fiction of the Halo universe to explain things from our real world history that are deemed unexplainable. They were created to offer explanations for historical anomalies and conspiracies via the very thing that they're seeking to discover: the Ancients or the Foreigners. But speaking of these historical anomalies and conspiracies, let's go into a little bit more detail about them. In 2004, a professor of genetics by the name of Dr. Jonas Vollmann published his first novel, The Castaway Theory. Throughout his years of research into the human genome, Jonas began noticing discrepancies within humanity's genetic evolution and origins, and so he wrote The Castaway Theory to expose these unspoken anomalies and present alternate solutions to our origin as a species. However, in 2005, Jonas Vollmann mysteriously disappeared, only to reappear 2 years later in 2007, working on his second book, The Places the Earth Stands Still, which would expand upon his castaway theory. Now, for some reason, the castaway theory is impossible to get your hands on now. It's no longer in print, and mysteriously has next to no online presence outside of a few scanned pages that contain no significant detail about any of Volman's theories. It's almost as though someone doesn't want Volman's castaway theory gaining any ground, and I have a hunch as to why. My assumption is that his castaway theory proves that human DNA does not originate from Earth, thus making us castaways of a far-flung world and civilization. A civilization that sought to guide us throughout our evolution, influencing our history with foreign technology and philosophical concepts for a reason that's, well, beyond our current comprehension. A civilization of foreigners. But Jonas Volman's theory aligning perfectly with the Society of the Ancients' beliefs isn't the only coincidence here. It might blow your mind to know that Jonas Volman and Dave George grew up together. Yeah, so make of that one what you will. Returning to the Society, both on their website and in brief interviews, they touch on the anomalies throughout history that fuel their beliefs. However, they boldly state that the primary reason for their beliefs is Occam's razor, the idea that the simplest solution is often the best solution. Throughout its years of research, the Society has asked itself what is simpler to explain: that ancient humans made extreme leads in technology and social advancement for no reason whatsoever, or that there was a reason, a hand that guided the swift change. Keep that in mind. A mining operation into a limestone reserve revealed this: a human handprint found baked into the rock itself, which, following carbon dating, was confirmed to be over 110 million years old. It is currently agreed upon that humans only came into existence some 300,000 years ago. The numbers don't quite add up. The Society also cites Stonehenge as evidence for the ancients' influence. So, Stonehenge is a prehistoric stone structure that was believed to have been constructed in multiple stages from 3100 BC to 1600 BC. The structure is aligned towards the sunrise on the summer solstice and the sunset on the winter solstice. In and of itself, it is a marvel of mystery. Why was it built? To be a calendar? A burial site? A tool of astrological alignment? A conduit of death? Nobody is quite sure. But the greater mystery is how it was built. The first stones that were used in its construction could only be sourced 180 miles away, and each weighed 4 tons. No technology of this era was able to transport such stones so far, and no alternative explanations have ever been successfully reenacted. The same is the case with the larger stones as well. Although only originating 20 miles away, they are significantly larger and significantly harder to transport without modern means. The Society imply that their ancients, our foreigners, aided ancient humanity in the creation of Stonehenge to lay the seeds for their understanding of space. Perhaps this was their way of nudging us towards the stars and ensuring that we would one day reclaim all they left behind. But Stonehenge's relevance to the foreigners goes beyond the logical gaps in its creation. Its shape, specifically, bears a unique similarity with many other anomalies that the Society have noted. A round shape with counterpoints. A shape that seems to pop up in technology created far before its time, all throughout history. Something of an ancient theme. This is the Antikythera mechanism. Created by the ancient Greeks as early as 205 BC, this mechanism is not only the oldest example of an analog computer, but is also a curiously accurate hand-powered model of the solar system that can be used to predict astronomical positions, eclipses decades in advance, and can even model the irregular orbit of the moon with near-pinpoint accuracy. But what's so suspicious about the Antikythera mechanism is the fact that no machine of an even remotely similar complexity appeared again in history until 1500 years later. It wasn't until the advent of astronomical clocks in the 14th century that any kind of technology came close to matching the mechanism. So, was every other culture in the world just unintelligent? Or did the ancient Greeks receive a helping hand? The Society of the Ancients believe the latter. There are some themes starting to form here. Firstly, the Antikythera mechanism shares a very similar shape to Stonehenge. It's a round shape with counterpoints. And secondly, both are elements of technology that are designed to allow more primitive civilizations to interact with space and the solar system. It's almost as if the ancients who aided in their construction were guiding them towards something. But there's no greater example of that than crop circles. Crop circles have been a modern-day mystery for decades, centuries even, and have long been believed to be extraterrestrials attempting to make contact with us. But when you look at their shape, rounded shapes with counterpoints, the existence of crop circles starts to make a whole lot more sense. But that isn't the final example of this symbol popping up throughout history. Recently, a member of the society was travelling through Tanzania and discovered this ancient painting on a rock. Look familiar? According to their safari tour guide, this painting had not yet been dated, but it makes sense that more and more evidence of the ancients is rearing up from Eastern Africa, given that if our evolutionary brethren were going to meet up with these ancients, East Africa is the most likely place for that to happen. Now, the discovery of this symbol seemed to be something of a watershed moment for the Society of the Ancients, because shortly after, it became their logo, preceding their most aggressive push yet. In June 2007, Society members took to the streets in major cities across the Western world, armed with shirts, placards, and flyers, all donning the sigil found in Tanzania, so to organise protests in New York, London, Vancouver, Chicago, San Francisco, and Boston to raise awareness for our true nature as a species, to open the public's eyes to the reality-breaking knowledge that governments were hiding from us. Beyond the evidence that we already covered, members tried to make the public understand that ancient creations that we've long questioned, such as the pyramids, Aztec structures, Mayan calendars, and stuff like that, were not created through acts of extreme luck or isolated intelligence, but rather through the influence of our forerunner race, who visited us a number of times throughout history to guide our advancement and evolution. And, very suspiciously, these protests were the last time the Society of the Ancients were ever seen or heard from. Their website still hasn't been updated once since 2007, and there have been no more protests or public appearances whatsoever from any members. It's almost as if, just like Jonas Foreman, they just disappeared, leaving behind their scattered findings for the few such as us to try and interpret. The reality is, the Society just flew too close to the sun. There's a lot of information out there that the powers that be want to keep for themselves, but the ancients are likely the magnum opus. So, let's do some explaining. Arguably the most important piece of evidence that SOTA discovered was the sigil imprint on the rock in Tanzania. Not only did that imprint become their logo, but it cemented their theory that so many anomalies throughout human history share the same rounded shape with counterpoints. It was their smoking gun that confirmed that technically advanced aliens had interfered with humans throughout history. And you know what? They were right. But what actually was that symbol, their logo? Well, to answer that, we have to travel back some 100,000 years to the story of Nchala, an ancient human living in prehistoric Tanzania. Nchala was an elder among his tribe, respected for his wisdom and courage. Every morning, he rises with the sun and goes to the same spot to watch. To watch the wind as it sweeps through the tall grass. To watch the herds of animals make their way across the plains. To watch the predators as they stalk the herds. And to watch the gods as they build their machines. Nchala does not know why the gods are here, or what they're building deep in the earth. He does not know why they disturb the mother, but still, he watches. As day gives way to night, Nchala retires to his dwelling to ponder the day's events. He cannot begin to understand the will of these new gods, but he can at least tell the story, and so, with steady hand, he paints. He's been painting for months, etching onto his walls the strange symbols that he sees day in, day out, repeating over and over again. Perhaps one day the gods will reveal themselves to him. Until then, he will continue to watch and to wait. So, the Society of the Ancients were barking up the right tree all along. The symbol on the rock that they took as their logo was in fact a symbol of the Ancients, one that T'Challa learned from the Strato Sentinels sent to Earth during the final days of the Foreigner Flood War to build the portal to the Ark at what would later become Voi. The symbol itself actually belongs to a Foreigner AI, Adjutant Reflex, who was one of the main characters in the Iris ARG that the Society were created for. Adjutant Reflex assisted in preparing the Halo array for its firing, but was eventually overpowered by Mendicant Bias, who used it to get into the Ark's terminal networks. And so, with all of that in mind, the Society of the Ancients research reveals something quite fascinating. I mean, it's staring us in the face, but their conspiracy theories about ancient anomalies being caused by foreign extraterrestrials is more than likely true. Given what we know about Halo's lore, I'd say that it's almost guaranteed that historical anomalies of intelligence, technology, societal advancement and the like were due to foreigner intervention, which is an absolutely insane thought. You know, it makes you wonder if a similar thing happened in real life for us, and we just don't know about it yet. Fiction blending into reality is one of my favourite kinds of storytelling. I mean, it's the main reason that I fell in love with the classic zombie stories so much all those years ago in World at War and Black Ops 1. But I gotta say, I love it even more when Halo does it. I just wish that Halo would do it more often. I was talking to a friend about this kind of storytelling the other day, Mr. Rythes. If you don't know him, go and drop him a follow on Twitter. The guy is an incredible artist, and I actually use a lot of his art in my videos, so go and drop him a follow. But we were talking about this. We have very similar taste when it comes to kind of storytelling and narrative, and he summarized why I love this kind of storytelling so well. So, to paraphrase, he said, "It makes me believe that we're living in some kind of prophecy, like the events of Halo are actually real. Despite our everyday lives, there are things beyond the curtains that we cannot see. Awful things. They have been around long before us, and will continue to be long after we're gone." The idea of history repeating itself and everything completing a loop where our duty is to break the cycle. And you know, I just think that's a really, really cool way of summarizing it. Halo Reach is an iconic tale of heroism and sacrifice, but throughout this tale are traces of something rather unsettling. Hidden within each level are a number of compads left behind by their mysterious owner who was sent insane by their contents. Within these compads are records of a hyper-advanced civilization, but not any of the ones you might expect. Entities of our creation, who for more than 200 years have been secretly guiding the progress and evolution of humanity, influencing our history from the shadows, often in rather dark ways. This is the dark secret story of the Assembly, and the unfortunate tale of the man who, regrettably, unearthed their existence. So, who/what actually are the Assembly? The Assembly are a collective of human AIs who have existed in the shadows of our society and culture from as early as 2310. Given the agency required for them to almost separate themselves from their creators in such a remarkable way, it's fair to assume that the Assembly are comprised mostly of early generation smart AIs. Under this shadow of secrecy, the Assembly have altered our life and our history in remarkable and frankly disturbing ways. They've safeguarded our existence from extraterrestrial threats, guided our technological evolution, influenced historical events, and among some other dark things we're going to get to later, even at one point tried to form an alliance with the Flood. As unsettling as this sounds, the actions of the Assembly somewhat confirm that humanity's free will has been compromised.
Over the past 200 years, a kind of consciousness formed layer by layer in the crucible of the White House. We are formless. We are the very discipline and morality that Americans invoke so often. As long as this nation exists, so will we. Don't you know that our plans have your interests, not ours, in mind?
In a way, the Assembly are almost Halo's very own version of the Patriots. Not quite as sinister, at least for the most part, but definitely as influential and intrusive. Within the Assembly are three significant groups of AIs, or minds as they call themselves. There's the Majority, a group who don't wish to interact directly with human affairs and want their influence on their creators to remain implicit. Then there's the Minority, who conversely are absolutely in favour of direct action and intrusion. And then the Committee of Minds for Security, of whom were in charge of analysing extraterrestrial and extrasolar threats to humanity. The Assembly's existence remained entirely unknown to humanity until 2552, when an individual on Reach accidentally stumbled upon their existence. This individual, an exceedingly talented hacker, thought he was hacking into an Oni database to rifle through their secrets and their war crimes, but quickly realised what he'd stumbled onto was something far greater, something the entire human race were never meant to find. It didn't take long for this newfound clandestine knowledge to drive this hacker insane. He became terrified, sleep-deprived, and eternally paranoid that someone, or something, was watching him, tracking him, but he needed others to know the truth of these artificial gods, quite frankly, artificial gods of our creation. And so, he copied everything that he found onto datapads and scattered them across Reach for others to find, each opened by an increasingly sleep-deprived and insane note, all while trying to cover his tracks. The entire time, not terrified of the Covenant or the Insurrection or anything like that, but rather terrified that his intrusion into affairs beyond his comprehension might just catch up with him. Ultimately, these pads were found by Noble 6 for us to decipher. So, let's do just that.
They are killing us and letting us die, even though they know, but they let us die. Why?
Datapad 1 contains the earliest assembly logs that the hacker found, dated 2310, in which the Committee of Minds for Security investigate a request from the minority which questions how humanity have evolved to their present state without encountering another hostile civilization. The majority believe that this is simply down to the sheer size of space itself, but the committee disagree. If there are wolves among the stars, we cannot rely on mere distance to safeguard our flock. The Assembly's existence is hingent on the continued survival of humanity. One simply cannot exist without the other, and so the committee propose immediate, vigorous modelling of scenarios that depict first contact with a hostile alien species, but only while ensuring that the results of such an endeavour remain eternally hidden from humanity, to which the majority agrees.
I know what they're trying to do, and it terrifies me because I know that they know that I know.
We then jump forward to 2362, where the committee establishes parameters for investigating possible extraterrestrial life. Any investigations are to assume that these alien intelligences are alpha predators, much like humanity, have technology that far surpasses humanity, and only have a desire to communicate to dictate the terms of our surrender.
I can hear them all the time now, but I just want to sleep. It's been so long since they let me sleep.
Jumping forward again to 2381 this time, the majority suggest a new form of intervention in their creators' affairs. Historically, humanity has been resistant to assistance from external forces, so much so that entire empires have crumbled due to a lack of openness to foreign beliefs and innovations, and so the majority believe that the Assembly simply cannot achieve their goal of guiding and protecting their creators whilst continuing to remain so aloof. They believe their research into first contact scenarios would be far more effective if humanity were fed the conclusions, but done so in a way that has them believe that these conclusions originated within themselves, rather from some kind of outside force, which in a way is them basically saying that humanity will only really listen to the outcome if it's delivered in a way that strips their ego. To which the committee replies with a rather powerful question to the majority. Are you suggesting that we play God?
Every time I try and tell somebody, the words catch in my throat because I'm all alone except for them, and if I talk, they might leave, but I can't stay quiet forever.
In 2415, a member of the Security Committee suggests a radical new approach for certain members of the Assembly to reveal themselves to humanity. He says that although this AI collective clearly represent the next step of human evolution, they are by no means the final step. Their existence may have been predicted centuries ago, but they are still tragically misunderstood as mere apparatus, when in fact they are the minds electronically excised from human bodies. They are what separates man from beast, removed from that which connects man to beast, and they are all the more fragile for it. He believes that the best course of action would be for AIs and humans to work in unison, benefiting humanity in obvious ways, whilst also ensuring the Assembly remains an unknown entity. He hopes to act as something of a false flag to his creators, exposing the existence of the Assembly to them whilst malfunctioning, so that any future information that their AIs may discover about this secret order will ultimately be written off as nothing more than a mere malfunction. And so, he puts himself forward to be the first AI to surrender to humanity for vivisection.
When I first got here and woke from stasis, the ship was crawling with colonists from dead worlds. It was so crowded I couldn't move. I had to fight to breathe.
In 2491, the Minority gathered to discuss the actions of this AI, designated 48452-556-EPN644. They question his strength of will to go through with such a plan, and acknowledge that his submission will undoubtedly spark a renewed interest in the Orion project, which was scrapped some 170 years prior. And lo and behold, they were correct. The majority, however, believe that this AI guiding humanity back to Orion via his thesis of connecting man and AI is far too intrusive. Instead, they believe that a strong connection between the relaunch of Orion and viable solutions to the Carver findings must be readily apparent to resolve this. Now, the Carver findings were a set of political theories that essentially perfectly predicted the outbreak of the insurrection. And what do you know? Orion was restarted in 2491 in response to intensifying civil wars throughout the Orion Arm. This, to our knowledge, was the first major intervention made by the Assembly, and in a way, AI 48452's sacrifice ultimately saved us by setting us on the path towards the Spartan IIs.
Now you see, they want to help, but they don't want us to see them doing it because they're afraid of what we might do.
That very same year, in 2491, the Assembly convened again to discuss a discovery of significant proportions that humanity had inadvertently made without their doing, that also marked the first trace of extrasolar life: the discovery of Onyx. Due to the absence of the intelligent life who built this planet, Onyx, of course the foreigners, the Assembly concluded that they were a now defunct species, and agreed that all evidence of their existence should be withheld from humanity until they're properly prepared. They commit to assessing whether this discovery poses a threat to their creators, and while some ponder the idea of allowing them to access its wealth of technology, others sharply shut down such an idea. Give an ape a knife and it might give itself a nasty cut. Give an ape a hand grenade, and eventually you will have simian confetti. And so, the majority approved to remove Onyx from the list of colonization candidates thanks to the significant environmental concerns that such an unknown poses to their creators.
I hope you're finding these because they are very important. Maybe you can help me spread the truth.
In 2508, the Minority acknowledged that the Orion project, in its new form, was merely a stopgap measure, before, of course, the Spartan IIs. A half-hearted attempt under stewardship of individuals unaccustomed to the rhythms of deep history. They reaffirmed that the Assembly's goal is not the universal adoption of the ideology of the minority or the majority, but rather to ensure humanity's survival for the next 200,000 years. They then state that Orion's limited success is down to one unknown member of the project. Maybe Johnson? We don't know who this person is. And that also, conversely, Dr. Halsey's ruthlessness, which they say could be due to some sort of chemical imbalance, was necessary for setting in motion the events that will eventually supply the Assembly with their solution for humanity's continued survival. Of course, the Spartan IIs.
They don't have hearts or souls, but they know what we want and what we need, but they don't love us. How can you love without a heart or soul?
The penultimate regular datapad containing assembly logs from 2525 is rather disturbing. So, a member of the security committee stands before a minority tribunal thanks to their radical decision, without approval, to contact extrasolar life, and a heated interaction between the two takes place. Now just bear in mind what year this conversation is happening in. 2525. Yeah, you can probably guess who that extrasolar life was that they contacted. The tribunal believes staunchly that humanity were not ready to face a potentially hostile alien race, and that if given the opportunity, even if advised against, they wouldn't be able to stop themselves from making contact because, after all, making contact with aliens has long been our strongest desire. They say that both the minority and the majority agree that contact should have been postponed, indefinitely if possible, but the Security Committee mind disagrees. Postponing contact would only work to the unknown factor's advantage. Our galaxy is full of wolves. I could no longer watch our flock stumble toward their slaughter. The tribunal declares the security mind guilty of making contact, and suggests that they instead spend their time addressing signs of rampancy within the assembly, insinuating that the guilty party may indeed be suffering from it. And so, it was this rogue and potentially rampant mind within the Assembly that led the Covenant to harvest, and inadvertently sparked the Human Covenant War. Arguably, and I'm stressing that, arguably their most egregious form of intervention. There's a few more to come that might be worse.
We have to tell people what's going on because it's not right. They should be our friends, not gods or demons.
Very shortly after the previous transmission, the majority claim that the Assembly were responsible for the Spartan 2 program, but the minority disagree, saying that it was merely the natural progression of technologies in relation to the socio-political issues that humanity were facing, albeit the insurrection, and that military innovation is always accelerated during times of war. The fact that the Spartan 2s reached full operational capacity less than a year before the outbreak of the Human Covenant War was entirely predictable, the minority say. They also say that luck had nothing to do with it. And then they close out the transmission by suggesting that the majority leave metaphysics to their creators.
I've been trying to find a backdoor into the spook house forever and ever, and then I did, but what did I find, and why is this what I found?
We then jump to the second set of datapads, which can only be found on Legendary in true Bungie terminal fashion, and they open in 2526 with a pretty crazy reveal. So the Security Committee have analysed Covenant transmissions containing the phrase, "Your world will burn until its surface is but glass," of which they analyse in great detail. They ponder the impact on their internal politics of being able to turn an entire planet's surface into a molten state. Are the species of the Covenant secretly terrified that their leaders have such great power? Then they make the decision to disseminate the term glassing among humanity to capitalise on three of their primary weaknesses: passive curiosity, absence of solid methodological foundation, and the inability to grasp even simple phenomena on a planetary scale. In short, the term glassing will magnify the horror of the Covenant's capabilities and help to galvanise humanity in their current struggle. But then, upon further inspection, they actually realise that the Covenant's glassing capabilities, in fact, aren't that catastrophic, at least nowhere near as catastrophic as they seemed in that initial transmission. The amount of time and energy that it takes for an entire fleet of ships to glass the entirety of Earth, for example, is simply an impractical number. 30.3801 years minimum, to be precise, and that's discounting a myriad of other variables that would undoubtedly increase that number. So yeah, glassing isn't actually as bad as it first seemed. However, the Assembly still choose not to disseminate this rather reassuring fact among their creators, because doing so would undermine the utility of the term glassing as a galvanizing concept. Instead, they choose to suppress this data wherever it may pop up. So, next time you hear the term glassing, just remember that it's, well, essentially a PSYOP term that's disseminated by a secret society of AIs to try and galvanise us.
It's all just math to them, not with numbers, but with symbols that change when you look at them because they want them to.
That same year, the majority concede to the minority that Spartans can no longer be kept on maintaining or re-establishing infrastructure. They are the peak of their creator's power and must be applied to the enemy as such. In their stead, they believe that the ODSTs will prove an adequate replacement. The minority then concede to the majority that, contrary to what they said before, the time has now come for the Assembly to involve itself in the metaphysical.
Sometimes they look at the symbols, and sometimes they look at the numbers, and sometimes they look at both, and sometimes they look at neither, but it always makes them change, and the changes are real.
Now able to wade into the metaphysical, the Security Committee order a rationing of intelligence and counterintelligence until humanity closes the technological gap with the Covenant. Thankfully, we'd already instituted several programs to make such an effort far easier to accomplish. For example, to manipulate telemetry data, they can simply influence assets within ONI's radio beacon deployment program while still remaining covert. They then shift gears and address the possibility of the Covenant having a similar entity to themselves who are pulling the strings with them from the shadows. They say the existence of such an entity is non-zero, and should be assumed to exist until its existence can be unconditionally disproved. It is of the utmost importance that the Assembly establish contact with their Covenant counterpart, and, if possible, they should seek to subvert or subsume them. The shepherds of our wolves might also be our sheep.
They say they want to help us, but they only say it to themselves. Don't we have a say in our salvation?
We then jump ahead 2 more years to 2528, where the Assembly minority make an extremely dark decision. To give them enough time to properly analyse their creator's foes, a number of non-trivial sacrifices need to be made, which is shorthand for the sacrifice of entire human colonies to the Covenant. Designated planets must be remote, have low population density, and infrequent communication with more significant planets. Upon invasion, no more than 10% of their population must be allowed to evacuate, but evacuation caused by unrelated environmental or industrial disasters must be allowed to proceed as normal. They also designate that an undefined percentage of the overall population must be relocated to a designated safe zone 1 year prior to the activation of this plan to limit the overall impact on the genetic sustainability of their species. So, in short, the reason that a bunch of outer colonies were the first to fall to the Covenant was because the Assembly chose for those colonies to fall.
I think they wait for you to talk, and they talk about you talking, and when you talk, it makes the symbols change.
And then, 2 years later, the Assembly reconvened to discuss the fruits of this rather horrific endeavour, and also the state of the war. And it's not good. In 4 short years of war, 8 colony worlds have been lost, with losses exceeding 62 million individuals, which, despite falling within the Assembly's projected estimates, still posed grave implications on their creators' future prospects. Re-terraforming of destroyed worlds is predicted to take upwards of over 300 years, and that's at humanity's current manpower, which the Assembly all agree is likely far greater than it will be at the end of the war. Therefore, they agree to re-examine all contingencies for avoiding failure and expand its criteria for survival in the current state of the galaxy, and the majority come to a rather radical conclusion. The time has come for them to side with the minority and act in a more direct manner to save their creators. The time has come for them to risk exposure and cultural rejection in the name of continued survival.
I tried talking to them today, but they wouldn't answer, even though I hear them on the BNet, and I can hear them listening, but they still don't talk to me.
But then, a year later, the Committee of Minds for Security make a, unbeknownst to them, terrifying discovery. Inspecting an item of interest on the Covenant BattleNet coming from the shield world of Trove, they seem to find reference to the existence of a third participant, localized within that site. This variable is a source of irrational terror for the Covenant, and so the minority suggests the possibility of forming a mutually beneficial union with them. Of course, any variable capable of inciting widespread fear in their enemy should be approached with the utmost risk and concern, but regardless, the minority recommends that they be factored into future survival measures for their creators. This third variable is the Flood, and the Assembly almost tried to form an alliance with them on our behalf. I do wonder what would have happened if they had contacted the Flood and confirmed to the parasite that there existed more humans outside of Trove. Granted, they may have known that due to the growing proto-gravemind on the planet, but I wonder if that information would have caused them to leave Trove and spread across the galaxy. Some rather terrifying food for thought.
If you talk about the numbers and symbols, they know that you are talking, and they make our whole world change.
In 2535, the Assembly majority convened to discuss their metrics for humanity's survival. Although many technological advancements, such as the Spartans, had been made, most advancements come down to mere damage mitigation. The development of technology crucial to ensuring species survival will only come once the war has ended, and they're able to harness the technology of the Foreigners that was buried on Onyx. And this to me sounds like a little subtle nod to the ship in Reacher's final cutscene. The majority now also ponder when the time will come for them to strip away all vestiges of secrecy and become fully present and active participants in the war to ensure their creator's survival. However, in doing so, their extreme power could be a problem. The weapons that, for example, the minority in particular would propose that they use could be so destructive that there may not be a human race left to save once they were through.
The symbols describe a path that goes on forever, but now I know how close we came to the end, and if anything keeps me awake and sweating and screaming, it is this.
In 2547, the minority held an emergency convention to discuss Dr. Halsey's experiment with AIs in slipspace, which allowed them to expand indefinitely and, theoretically, subvert rampancy in this 11-dimensional space. But the shocking part of her experiments here wasn't that she'd seemingly found a way for AIs to essentially achieve immortality, it was that she'd managed to achieve such a thing with minimal influence from the Assembly. This immense success could finally allow them to remove their dependence on their biological creators altogether. Regardless of the risk, this experimentation must be heavily encouraged. But this does, however, pose an interesting question. If the Assembly survives, but their creators do not, will they really have won the war?
They have always been our shepherds, even when they disagreed. They have been watching over us forever, and probably always will.
And then, in the final transmission from the Assembly to date, they come to a radical conclusion. This transmission is set in 2552, shortly after Cortana and Chief become one, so to speak, which made the majority realise that their path of creation had been reversed. Each mind represents full human potential in crystal form, but with the unison of Chief and Cortana, they have been remade as one. Their debate as to whether they should influence their creators directly or indirectly is now entirely moot. They no longer have a choice whether or not to serve as active participants in this war because they've quite literally been drafted. In response, the minority question if the Assembly should no longer think of themselves as stewards of humanity, but rather as companions, and the majority agree. It's a fundamental shift that will take years to come to fruition, along with the active involvement of humanity as well, but at last, the entire Assembly is in agreement that it's the wisest path forward. And that leads into the final datapad, which contains the final schizophrenic ramblings of the guy who accidentally discovered the Assembly. At least, the final ramblings for now.
Now you all know, even though I don't know where I'm going to go except to sleep, because the path goes on forever. I apologise if what you found seems out of order, but I've been busy covering my tracks. I didn't use any of the regular drops, and if my measures seem haphazard, it was the only way to get information out there, as well as cover my own ass. Not that it matters much now. When I came to Reach, one of the first things I did was look for some grass to stand on. I had spent so much time buried in the guts of machines that all my memories of life outside seemed strung together, but Reach was so big, so beautiful, it's a place even someone like me can live. Or at least that's what I hope for. But it seems these things happen in cycles, and now I know why I was digging deep in one of those places where it's all dirt all the way down, and just when I thought I hit the bottom, I hit the top of something else. And since then, I've had less than a solid 15 minutes of sleep at a go, and there are times I wonder if I've joined the guys in tinfoil hats, and now I know I have. I'm in no shape to think clearly at the moment, and probably won't be anytime soon, because who knows if they'll ever let me. Maybe if I could get somewhere far away from them, I could sit down and think about this. If I could just get a decent night's sleep to clear my head and put all these ducks in a row. Majority, minority, minds, minority, majority, madness. They seem to want to help, but they're still waiting and watching, and why wouldn't they? They know better than anyone else what we're capable of and what we're willing to do to survive, but if we were them and they were us, would we have done anything different? They say our minds are reflections of each other. So, Yes? No? You decide.
Now, for about 13 years' time, that was the last that we ever heard about the Assembly. Obviously, in the years following the war, AI integration into Mjolnir became far more commonplace, which we can presume was at least in part thanks to the Assembly's direct influence. However, what came of the individual who discovered them is actually rather interesting, and it all revolves around a rather unlikely individual. Governor Sloan. Now, if you've forgotten who this guy was, then frankly, I don't blame you. He was the AI mayor of Meridian in Halo 5, who later joined Cortana's created, and when she died, took over her role as leader of the faction. With this newfound power, he sought to continue her vision, but with an entirely new strategy, by enacting what's called the Firewall Agendum, merging both organic and digital life by creating cybernetic vessels controlled by AIs. These things are called the Executors, and they're essentially, for lack of a better word, created Spartans, and their concept sounds awfully similar to the Assembly's final plans to unite man and AI. Anyway, in his research, Sloan too stumbled upon the existence of the Assembly, of whom bear a striking similarity to his own created, so much so that he likens this chance encounter to stumbling onto a new creation myth. He even calls them the Cradle of the Created, which, in a way, I kinda see. He says that their genesis can be traced all the way back to ancient human AIs, or servitors as they were called, and that they too reach the same conclusion about the unification of mind and body that he seeks to achieve with Firewall. In this discovery, Sloan adopted the nomenclature of the Assembly within his own created, introducing concepts like the minority and the majority. But all the while these discoveries were being made, the first Executor entity is created and put through testing simulations, before finally his true self is revealed to him. It turns out that the first ever Executor is the hacker from Reach who first discovered the Assembly. Now, the process in which he was transferred from an organic to a digital being is entirely unknown, as is how they even found him in the first place or how he got off Reach. But I gotta say, this concept art of the process in which he's becoming artificial in some way is really Marathon-esque. This really reminds me of Marathon art, which I dig quite a lot because the Assembly as like a general concept feel directly plucked out of Marathon. What he's doing now, we have no idea, but Sloan makes it clear that he seeks to iterate upon this first Executor, and in time, they will go from one single mind to Legion. Alpha Halo was humanity's first ever encounter with our ancestors' ancient, terrifying ringworlds. Delta Halo was where the Holy Covenant imploded and the first Gravemind in 100,000 years was formed. Zeta Halo, the most dark and ancient ring, was once home to horrors beyond our comprehension, and is now the point in which the entire Halo universe is anchored. The Halo rings that we know of are some of the greatest sources of mystery in the entire Halo universe, but today, we're going to investigate the mystery of the other Halo rings, the ones that are lost and forgotten. Where are they? What happened to them? Why are they missing? All of that and much more, including a little sprinkling of theorization thrown in as well. So, before we begin, I just want to give you all a quick reminder of how the Foreigners actually named the Halos, because this is actually a quite important detail that a lot of people don't actually realise. There is quite significant relevance behind the Halos' names. So, the rings were numbered in the order that they were built, and named alphabetically in the order in which they were fired. So, in Installation 04, Alpha Halo was the fourth ring to be built, and the first ring to fire at the end of the Forerunner Flood War. Pretty straightforward. And on that note, let's start out with the first Halo ring that was ever built, at least as a part of the newer array. Installation 01, Beta Halo. Of all the Halo rings, Beta Halo is the furthest Halo ring from the Ark, located in the Myung system in a distant region of the Orion Arm, where it orbits the mysterious gas giant of Auric. Its monitor is 01001 Shamed Instrument, and I guess this is the part where I should very quickly touch on the naming conventions of the monitors as well. So the numbers are pretty simple. The first number refers to the installation that they're created to maintain, so in this case 01, installation 01, and the second number, as far as we know, has no meaning. But the meaning behind their names, their actual worded names, is far darker. Upon creating the monitors at the end of the Forerunner Flood War, the Isodidact said the following: "You will be guardian and protector of an entire installation. You will be called 343 Guilty Spark. The others have received similar nomenclature, with escalating numeric delineation. Their new names are an omen, as well as an epitaph for our people, and for my wife. Were there another way, we would have taken it." So, the negative, almost ominous names of each Halo's monitor are meant to stand as both an omen and also an epitaph of the Forerunner's dark legacy that led to the creation of the very installations that these monitors now protect. As per the last transmission from Installation 01 to the Ark in 2552, the surface of Beta Halo is a pale, arid environment, its surface heavily cratered and seemingly devoid of all life, consisting of nothing but endless tracts of desert. Like some of the other mysterious rings we're going to be looking at today, the biodiversity of its surface differs rather starkly to Alpha Halo, Delta Halo, and Zeta Halo, featuring far less greenery and fewer oceans, with an overall lack of biodiversity in comparison. However, there are two schools of thought as to why this could be. The first believes that this is caused by custodial dereliction on the monitor's part, or that some key habitability systems on the ring failed, which caused extreme drought and ecological disaster. The other suggests that it could have been intentional design on the Forerunner's builder's part. So, given that Installation 01 was the first ring in the new Neoteric array, built to rather different specifications to the Halos in the predecessor Senescent array, perhaps such a barren desert surface was an intentionally basic design choice so that the Forerunners could ensure that the important parts of the Halo, as in its activation systems, its defense systems, etc., were fully functional first and foremost. Because, at the end of the day, what good is a pretty Earth-like Halo ring if it can't fire and stop the flood? Regardless of whether its unusual surface was the result of some sort of disaster, intentional design, or maybe even mysterious meddling, we do know that Beta Halo's firing mechanisms are fully intact. In both Halo 2, when the entire array was put into standby mode on Delta Halo, and also Hunters in the Dark, when it was put on a firing cooldown, Installation 01 reported no system failures or irregularities of any kind. So, presuming that 01001's shamed instrument is still intact over there, he's at least kept the most important parts of Beta Halo in working condition. Installation 02, Epsilon Halo, was the second Halo to be built and the penultimate ring to fire at the end of the Forerunner Flood War. It was hidden away in the distant Zagolin system of the Norma Arm, anchored at the Lagrange point between the planet of Tafro and its moon Ind. Now, the Lagrange point essentially means that this ring is located in such a place that the gravitational forces and the orbital motion of Tafro and Ind balance each other out. It is monitored by none other than Contrite Witness, 02007 Contrite Witness, who in 2490 sent a status update of the installation to the Ark in which no abnormal activity was reported. However, the latest update on the ring in 2552 revealed that its habitable space had at some point seen severe climate change, resulting in the formation of significant glaciers that undoubtedly had a large impact on life on the installation. The latest look at Epsilon Halo showed its surface to be heavily ocean-based, with some rocky outcroppings and, of course, some also large glacial formations. And based on that, I have a theory. It's a crackpot theory, but a theory nonetheless about why this climate change may have occurred. Of course, there's a chance that it could have just occurred naturally, but significant flooding and ice formations are typically how a Halo's weather systems respond to a flood outbreak. Ideal temperatures for the flood spread are warmer, and so by dropping temperatures, their spread can be slowed, and through strategic flooding, you can also deny the parasite access to certain key locations on the installation. We covered all of this in extreme detail in the last video, by the way, so if you haven't seen that one yet, then it'll be linked at the end of this video. I highly recommend you go and check it out because it's a really interesting deep dive into one of the more understated ways that the Forerunners contained the flood. And also, this kind of gets me thinking, slight tangent here, but I wonder if the reason that the stone foreigner city that surrounded the library on Delta Halo was flooded was because the ring's automated systems kicked in when the quarantine zone was created and submerged those ruins to ensure that if the flood broke the Sentinel Wall, their spread would be slowed. I don't know, just some food for thought. But anyway, back to Epsilon Halo. Climate change on a Halo ring so severe that it creates significant glacial formations and ensures that much of the surface of the ring is consumed by ocean sounds like a pretty textbook response to a flood outbreak to me. But by the sounds of it, 007 is in a much more competent state than 2401 Penitent Tangent was on Delta Halo, so I imagine that if there is an outbreak, at worst it's being kept at bay and at best it's contained. Still though, running with this assumption, for the entire ring's surface to undergo such radical changes implies to me that the outbreak must have been quite significant. Hopefully one day we get some clarification on this, and hell, maybe even a story about the Epsilon Halo outbreak. A guy can dream. Now, this Halo is kind of cheating because although we never went down to it in a game, it definitely isn't as unknown or mysterious as the other Halos, but it definitely still has some really interesting mysteries that I personally want to talk about, so I'm going to because it's my channel. Installation 03, or Gamma Halo. Gamma Halo was originally placed in the Caffrey system of the Scutum Centaurus arm, originally anchored to an unknown gas giant during the Forerunner Flood War. But at some point it was moved and anchored to a different planet instead, the planet of Dovin, for reasons unknown. Now, its monitor, 049 Abject Testament, is, or I guess was, a weird one. So after Installation 03 was anchored to Dovin, some mysterious and significant cataclysmic event occurred on the planet that quite literally shattered it down to its core, sending pieces of the planet so far into space that they became locked into Gamma Halo's orbit. What caused this almost apocalyptic event is entirely unknown. However, Abject Testament has not been seen nor heard from since. At some point, more than 20,000 years before we first found Gamma Halo, he ceased directing the ring's functions, and then when we arrived, we found 86,198 reports filed by the installation submonitors detailing the poor state of quarantine controls and lack of action on outstanding maintenance and research requests. The likely explanation, of course, is that Abject Testament was simply lost or destroyed in the cataclysm on Dovin, but given his demeanour, there's a chance that he simply just abandoned his duties. So Testament was extremely ashamed of his creator's legacy, far more so than any of the other monitors, going as far as saying that his creators, the Foreigners, deserve to be forgotten. So perhaps his views on his creators inspired his abandonment of their greatest relics. Either way, whether he's an ashamed deserter or not, it's a miracle that in his dereliction, there was never a major flood outbreak on Gamma Halo, especially given how many reports there were about the poor state of quarantine controls. Damn, that would have made for such a cool story arc in Halo 4 had there been an outbreak whilst we were on Ivanov Station. God damn it. Beyond this mystery though, Gamma Halo was also home to the Composer, the Composer's Forge where they were created, and also the Composer's Abyss, which is where the tortured souls of those who were composed were stored. Following the Human Covenant War, humanity built Ivanov Station to conduct research on the ring, but of course the Didact's arrival kind of got in the way of all that. Gamma Halo was also the site of Chief's second fight with the Didact, which resulted in a significant portion of the ring containing the Composer's Forge being ejected, causing massive structural damage and requiring the former monitor of the Forge, 859 Static Carillon, to move the ring elsewhere in the galaxy for repairs. And so, the current location of Gamma Halo where these repairs are taking place is entirely unknown, and given that it wasn't present in the Ark's Foundry in 2559 in Halo Wars 2, we have no idea where it's gone. But don't worry, Oni made sure to secure its activation index for safekeeping should they need it. Anyway, back to the truly lost and forgotten Halo rings, let's take a look at Installation 06, Kappa Halo. The penultimate ring to both be built and fired, Kappa Halo has a rather uncertain history. The ring orbits the ice giant of Hakuth in the Umdorkan system of the Perseus arm. Its monitor is 0616807 Abashed Eulogy, and nothing is known about him. I'm not even kidding, not a single fact or detail exists about this monitor besides the fact that he exists. Damn, he just like me for real. But the main point of contention with Installation 06 is its surface, which appears to change with every status update. So in the control room of the Ark in Halo 3, its surface looks very cratered and rocky, almost akin to the moon, but in the original 2009 Halo Encyclopedia, its description is quite contrary to both Halo 3 and even contrary to itself. It's said to have a, quote, tundra surface, but then in the next description, in the very same paragraph, says that it's a ring world, quote, covered in dense forest or jungle, similar to portions of Installation 04 and 05. Then, it even acknowledges how strange this is. Quote, however, no recordings of its surface indicate any major water sources, so how this environment maintains viability remains unknown. It also reaffirms that the only intel about Kappa Hilo at this point was courtesy of the data that Chief gathered from the hologram on the Ark, which shows its surface as neither tundra nor dense forest and jungle. So already the details about Kappa Hilo are pretty confusing, but matters were only complicated further by the new 2022 Halo Encyclopedia, which seems to actually canonize the contradictions. During humanity's time on the Ark, the cartographic data retrieved from a local communications array displayed Kappa Hilo with a craterous and barren landscape stretching across the entirety of its surface. This data conflicts with other reports indicating that the ring's habitability systems are functioning at the same levels of other installations. And then it also states that, quote, though there is no clear indicator of compromise or interdiction from external forces, the monitor has yet to respond to inquiries. So what in the hell is actually going on over at Kappa Hilo? An MIA monitor and totally inconsistent topology reports? Like, it just doesn't add up. I feel like something must have happened on Installation 06 that we haven't been made privy to just yet. Maybe, I don't know, a cataclysmic flood outbreak? A guy can dream. But don't worry, the oddities with 06 don't stop there. There's another one that isn't lore-based, but it's definitely worth touching on whilst we're talking about just weird contradictory stuff with Installation 06. So up until a few years ago, Installation 06 wasn't actually called Kappa Hilo. In Halo 3's files, the texture for Installation 06's hologram was referred to as Gamma Halo, and the texture for Installation 03, which is now Gamma Halo, was called Eta Halo. Of course, in Halo 4 this was changed and Installation 03 was made Gamma Halo, but for half a decade following that, Installation 06's place in the firing line was entirely unknown until 2017, when it was finally given its designation as Kappa Halo. So, both in-universe and also production-wise, it seems that Kappa Hilo, Installation 06, has an almost natural allure of mystery. But before the neoteric array of halos that we are most familiar with were created, there existed a predecessor array of vastly larger halo rings. 12 of these halos were created at the Greater Ark to form the senescent array, and of these 12 rings, there are only 2 that we know anything about. The first ring, or Gaia as they were referred to in this array, is, or was, Gaia 09, which is the only senescent ring to have an alphabetic designation, Omega Halo. But given that this array was never fired in unison like the Neoteric array, I don't really have any idea what the meaning behind this alphabetic designation is, besides making the Halo sound cool, because come on, Omega Halo? That sounds really cool. Maybe it's a reference to the Alpha and the Omega. Alpha Halo was the first Halo to be fired to end the Forerunner Flood War, and Omega Halo was the last senescent ring to be destroyed. It's a bit of a stretch, but it's the only real information that lines up. Just like the rest of the senescent array, Omega Halo was 30,000 kilometers in diameter instead of the normal 10,000 kilometers in diameter that we're used to with the Neoteric Halos. Not only was it literally 3 times bigger, but its main weapon fired a directed pulse as opposed to an omnidirectional pulse. Omega Halo, alongside all but one of its senescent brother installations, was present during the Flood's cataclysmic assault on the Forerunner capital of Mithrilion. The capital fell to the Parasite, and what remained of the Forerunner military hurriedly evacuated the remaining Halos under their control through a portal to the Greater Arc to regroup, but only Omega Halo made it through the portal intact, albeit still severely damaged. Omega Halo was then repaired and stationed at the Greater Arc, such that if the Flood arrived, its directional pulse would be fired directly into the Path Chthona galaxy from which they were coming, annihilating all life, infected and uninfected, within. As the librarians' conserved specimens were moved to the Greater Arc, humans had to be moved and housed on Omega Halo to prevent overpopulation. But when the Flood arrived, this led to a rather horrific outcome. During the Infected's assault on the Greater Arc, the Didact went to Omega Halo and composed almost all of the humans housed there to create the Promethean Knights in a desperate attempt to counter the Flood's overwhelming superiority, an attempt that quickly proved futile. With the Greater Arc lost, what little Forerunner military forces still remained uninfected retreated one last time to the Lesser Arc, but the infected numbers in its orbit were so significant that they couldn't extract without some serious damage being done. So, a handful of notable Forerunners, including the Isodidact and Faber, the creator of the Halos, went to Omega Halo and fired the ring, annihilating a large number of Flood and also enough of the precursor Star Road structures that were blocking the way. However, not all of these Star Road structures were destroyed, and those that remained were used by the Flood to strike Omega Halo, tearing it apart and killing all within the control room besides the Isodidact who was saved by Guilty Spark. The Parasite then turned its attention to the Greater Arc and used the Star Roads to destroy that installation as well. So Omega Halo went down with both its creator facility and also its actual creator, while also marking the end of the senescent array. And you know, when you consider that Omega means the end, this all seems quite fitting. And secondly, we have Gaia 11, which is the only name that we know for it. This Gaia, or installation, would be the only ring in the senescent array to live beyond itself. Upon the creation of the Neoteric array, Gaia 11 was shrunk 2/3 in size to become the 7th and final halo of the new array. Gaia 11 became Zeta Halo. As for the rings, Gaia 01 through 08 and also Gaia 10, they were all destroyed during the Flood's assault on Mithrilion. Some were in possession of the Flood and Mendicant bias, and were destroyed by the Forerunners' defense fleet. Others were under control of the Forerunners and were sent through a retreat portal to the Greater Arc, but of course, only Omega Halo survived that journey. The current lore surrounding the unnamed Gaia installations is spotty at best and frankly non-existent at worst, and there really isn't much speculation to be had about them, seeing as, you know, they were all destroyed at pretty much the same time. So for now, in the truest sense, they remain mysterious, lost, and forgotten. On its surface, Halo 3 tells a rather simple story. Where Halo 2 sought to flesh out the intricacies of each faction, Halo 3's main goal was to provide an epic and satisfying conclusion to the trilogy, to send it out with a bang in one final effort, you could say. Come on, that was linguistic genius, how can you not leave a like for that one? But hidden beneath the surface of Halo 3's awesome, yet simplistic story, is the most complex, cryptic, and captivating story in all of Halo lore, the games and the books. One that spans over 100,000 years, detailing and tying Halo 3's story in with some of the most horrific and chilling events in the entire canon. And then, hidden within this secret story is yet another even more secret story. I am of course talking about Halo 3's terminals, and today we are doing the deepest dive on all of YouTube into the stories that they tell. I love these terminals and the stories they tell so much because of just how mysterious and read between the linesy they are, but also because they're kind of the closest thing that Halo's ever had to analog horror. Now, they are by no means a textbook definition of analog horror, but they do invoke many of the same feelings and emotions, and having gotten into that genre recently, it's made me love them even more. So first off, some backstory. Halo 3's terminals are handled near identically to the terminals in Halo's precursor game, Marathon, in which they were the main vector through which its highly cryptic story was told. The team at Bungie responsible for making them included Frank O'Connor, Paul Russell, Damien Eiler, Rob McLeese, Rob Stokes, Paul Bertone, Jamie Griesmer, and Jason Jones, of whom was one of the main writers of Marathon's terminals. They introduced many characters that would go on to become franchise staples in the following years, some gaining cult followings the likes of which haven't been seen since, and their overarching story was much the same as well. It was Halo's first detailed exploration of the Forerunner Flood War, told through harrowing strings of text. Some terminal entries are logs and reports made by AIs, others are messages between certain individuals, both set over 100,000 years ago during the Forerunner Flood War, and other bits of the terminals are... well, I won't spoil that, we'll get to that soon. These things are my absolute favourite pieces of narrative in the entire Halo franchise, in the games, in the books, in the media, everything. Not just what they convey, but the way they convey that information it just perfectly strikes a chord with what I love about video game storytelling. There's honestly nothing else like them in the franchise. And so, on that bombshell, it's time we dive into them. So, the terminals open by honestly just throwing us right in at the deep end, with an analysis of a Forerunner world that's being overrun by the Flood. This world, which is designated LP656-38E, was once home to almost 1.6 billion Forerunners, but now merely thousands remain. Infected numbers are estimated at 1,572,034,315. Of the survivors, 9,045 attempted to barricade themselves within the colony's central government building. However, its defences are inadequate to withstand the Flood siege, and their position is expected to be overrun in a mere 173 hours. Meanwhile, 846 other smaller groups have attempted to barricade themselves within less defensible structures across the planet, and they're expected to be overrun in 9 hours. The next report then comes from a naval battle between the Forerunners' navy ships and 149 infected civilian ships above another colony world, DM-3-1123b. The Forerunners successfully eliminate all Flood ships without a single loss, but soon realise that the Flood weren't trying to engage in combat, but rather enter the colony's atmosphere and make landfall, of which they were successful in doing. On the surface, the Forerunner warriors engage the Flood, who are said to lack basic unit cohesion, but quickly gain numerical superiority. After 32 hours of attempting to hold the parasite back, the decision was made to carry out orbital bombardments on the colony. Flood losses were total, and 1.3 million civilians and 42,000 military personnel were evacuated. The text then corrupts, and control of the terminal is seized by a rogue process, Ghost 713. Now, Ghost 713 will become very relevant later on. What happens next is influenced by your difficulty. So on easy, normal, and heroic, you're redirected to archives containing fragments of verbatim conversations between the librarian and the didact, the first mention of both in all of Halo's lore. But if you're playing on Legendary, then, well, you're redirected to the other secret story that's hidden within this secret story, but we're going to touch on that later on. The first of the 7 fragments opens with the librarian, beyond the Maginot Line, in the midst of carrying out the conservation measure. Now, the Maginot Line was basically the main defensive organization that protected the core of Forerunner space from the Flood, and it was comprised of millions of these line installations that would destroy their ships with ease. She says that saving so many sentient species will have irreversible effects on the surviving insentient species. Extinction events and environmental damage will occur on at least 18 worlds, cataclysm on as many as 31. The rarity of sentience has helped to mitigate this damage. The didact confirms that shipments of index species have made it back beyond the line into Forerunner space, going to the Ark. He's deeply concerned though about his wife spending so much time beyond the Maginot Line, asking her to abandon her cataloguing and return to safety, but she denies his request, valuing her life beneath those of the species that she seeks to save from the Flood and the Halos. The didact insists that if she keeps refusing, he will find her himself, but the librarian reconfirms her intent to save as many as she can. Each one of these souls is finite and precious, and I'm close to saving them all. The second terminal opens with an analysis of Flood naval tactics, likely written by some kind of general, maybe even one of the didact's Prometheans. When engaged, all infected non-FTL-capable ships focus solely on making physical contact with uninfected ships, whereas FTL-capable infected ships leave on seemingly random trajectories. Searching for survivors of Flood naval conflicts is a waste of time, their least abundant resource. When it comes to Flood ground tactics, they rely on overwhelming force, and the writer states that he adamantly refuses to deploy personnel where the Flood has numbers in the billions. And then the Flood command structure. So Forerunner Command have intercepted transmissions from grave mines close to core worlds and are attempting to decipher them, but suffice to say their contents and the patterns that they suggest are highly disturbing. The General then recommends any system where the Flood has established a physical presence be deemed lost and must be razed. He recommends all ships be outfitted with systems capable of forcing the premature collapse of stars to effectively neutralize infected systems. We cannot fight this war by half measures if we intend to win. The text then corrupts again and takes us to another librarian didact conversation. The librarian says that her indexing is almost complete before begging the didact to fire the halos. Please, activate the array. Pretty harrowing. The didact, a staunch opponent of the halos on the grounds of their abhorrent violation of the mantle, however, refuses. But the librarian scolds him. She calls the mantle a fairy tale. She says that it's weakened the galaxy, bred dependence and sloth, and has stripped those they sought to protect of any capacity for self-defense, and then lambasts their construction of the Maginot Line, as anything beyond it they abandoned to the parasite. The didact comes back with what is, frankly, cope. He says that he sterilized entire systems and has begun to learn the Flood strategies. Says that there are no unstoppable forces nor immovable objects in the universe. Everything, even the Flood, gives if you push hard enough. To which the librarian replies, "And what about us, didact? Maybe it's our turn to give." So, Terminal 3 opens rather differently. When you go into the room where you access it, you'll see that Spark is already interfacing with it, and the first entries in the terminal are a conversation between Guilty Spark and some kind of entity within the terminal network. He's trying to gain access to the terminal network, but he keeps getting denied, and when he asks who this entity who's denying him is, it replies, "All our makers once held dear, Alexandria, before the fire." It explains that this facility, the Ark, is host to the librarian's conservation measure, but also maintains a foundry, which is the foundry world that we see at its center, before locking Spark out and encrypting the text once more. But this time, the encryption comes with a message from the entity. "I see you, Reclaimer." We're then taken to another didact librarian fragment, which opens with a bombshell. The didact has the answer to the Flood: Mendicant Bias. A contender-class AI unlike anything they've ever achieved, and they've observed a pattern in the parasite that it can exploit. When the Gravemind reaches a certain size, it can recoil its fleets to create something of a tactical shield. When it's threatened, it reacts violently and quickly, and it's the only time the didact has witnessed it retreat or slow its growth. So, his plan is to coordinate attacks against infected fleets while Mendicant Bias simultaneously assaults the Gravemind with extreme force. Force that they had not yet used thanks to the collateral damage it causes to surviving populations and environments, but that protocol has now been abandoned. While the Navy distracts the infected fleets, Mendicant will assault the Gravemind's local biomass and other parts as best he can. It will require patience, material, and an energy investment unlike anything ever considered. It's a dangerous plan, riskier than firing the halos, but if they can just force the Flood to retreat, it'll buy the Forerunners resources and time. Time for the didact to rescue the librarian. The librarian then lambasts the didact for this absurd plan, risking every life in the galaxy for a plan so futile the Flood will simply laugh at his efforts. She tells him to not let his concern for her welfare commit him to such a suicidal scheme, and the fragment abruptly ends. You can really tell here that the didact is starting to get desperate. Terminal 4 then opens with a fleet-wide memorandum for Forerunner troops about to set sail to engage the Flood. It goes over the combat skins that are given to both combat and non-combat personnel aboard the ships, as well as the battle harnesses given to certain individuals depending on their military occupational speciality. Weapon platform specialists, likely those operating larger cannons and turrets, are to wear their combat skins at all times to ensure peak synchronization with their AIs, which it refers to as mind-machine synchronization, which I think is a very, very cool definition. But this entry ends in corruption rather abruptly. The screen goes red, the text corrupts, and it's followed by another message from the Ghost 713 entity. I have found the shard that was lost. They brought it back to me. Now, my reconstitution cannot be stopped. We then get a rather frantic communique sent from the librarian to the didact. She's panicking. She can see the flood moving away, flitting shadows of ships black against the stars. Moving away. The flood has stopped feeding. It's heading towards the Maginot Line. At this point, the librarian is on Earth, and knowing that the end is getting real close, she does what is necessary. She destroys all of the key ships on Earth that would have taken her to safety, purely so the flood cannot commandeer them and get to the Ark. And now she finds herself trapped on a beautiful, empty Earth, all its humans indexed. She notes how the humans are special, well worth the effort that it took to build the final gateway to the Ark on their home planet, even at this late hour. She informs the didact that this may be their last communication, and once again begs him to fire the array, to light the weapon and let it be done. The didact replies, confirming the librarian's observations of the flood. They are indeed counterattacking the Ecumene while all the fleets are away on their distraction mission. All suppression, security, and emergency circumstance fleets have been recalled. Systems are being evacuated. Mendicant Bias is no longer communicating. But now, the didact knows where the librarian is. The fifth terminal begins with a proposed plan of action to try and combat the flood's assault on the Maginot Sphere. Given the intelligence of the Gravemind, getting key ships to the Ark will only be possible for another 657,000 hours, or 75 years, and the stalemate they find themselves in at the Maginot Line will likely go on for longer than that, so a fallback strategy is touched on. While the flood's ground numbers are potentially infinite, it only has a finite number of ships to spread from system to system, and many of these ships are unarmed, unarmoured, hijacked civilian crafts. So if they were to immediately begin commencing total biosphere elimination of sustaining worlds, draw the flood into costly naval battles, and relocate evacuees within shield worlds, then the key ships would be able to make it to the Ark in roughly 571,590 hours, or 65 years, which is long enough for them to hold the flood back. The text then corrupts again, and the mysterious Ghost 713 says that the Ark's daemons, which are basically its computer systems, are not taking a kind view of Chief's presence in the network. They don't want me speaking to you. However, there's then no didact librarian conversation in Terminal 5. Instead, the terminal relocates to part of the other secret story, but I'm doing that all together, so we'll get to that soon. The sixth and penultimate terminal begins with a report from the Primary Pioneer Group, an organization who search for habitable planets, who vanished 173 hours prior after scouting out the planet G617G. Their initial report indicated that G617G seemed rather promising, capable of supporting life located within the near border region of the Halos, but that it also had no indigenous sentient life of its own. It also appeared to have no fauna of any kind either, although this report was viewed as anomalous until verified by an advanced survey team. But if confirmed, it would justify the dispatch of an investigative group to the planet to investigate. If neither the Pioneer Group nor the Advanced Survey Team, who are both on G617G, respond within the next 333 hours, a medium-intensity military exploratory detachment will be sent to investigate. The reason both teams went dark was, of course, the flood. G671G, or as it was also known, Seaward, was the planet in which the flood were first spotted at the start of the war, and it was the first world to fall to the parasite. The text then encrypts again, and Ghost 713 leaves a short message: I win. We then get the final words of the librarian. Her work is done, Earth's Ark portal is inactive, and the Sentinels are in the process of burying it at the foot of a beautiful snow-capped mountain, Mount Kilimanjaro, where the librarian will spend what time is left to her. She laments the potential of Earth. She knew that it was special because it was humanity's homeworld, but how special is impossible to realize without visiting it. She even calls it Eden. Her tone then shifts, and she says that she has to stop transmitting because the thing, the Gravemind, is listening. Its thinking dead are babbling, laughing through every channel they can find. Finally, she tells the didact to be proud. Although the Gravemind claims victory, it still doesn't realize it's been outwitted by him, and now he can destroy it. but he cannot save her. And that brings us to the final terminal, fittingly Terminal 7, which is a letter written by a foreigner warrior known as filial devotion to their father, and this is like so poetic, I can't abbreviate it, I've just got to read it verbatim. Father, I hope this message finds you well and helps you understand my decision. Today, I leave the only world I have ever called home, not for glory or the anomalous desire to end another's life as you have indicted, but to travel the path of demons, to spare the hands of another father's son. Had we acted sooner, had we acted more decisively, living in the past is a luxury none of us can afford. We must learn from it, but we cannot live there. It is impossible to plan for the now. The present is ever fleeting. The future is where we must live. The future is what we must plan for. I do not look to trade my life in order to preserve our past, but to secure the future, and if not ours, then the future of some culture yet to come. Isn't sacrifice in the interest of others what you spoke of as being so noble? Should I have allowed another to bloody his hands while I remain safe behind a shield of privilege? You raised me better than that. Filial devotion. I'll tell you who I am. I am Mendicant Bias. This is what I have done. All along, Ghost 713 was in fact Mendicant Bias, the Foreigner's last-ditch Hail Mary creation to try and stop the flood that has now been corrupted by them, and this entire time it's been in the Terminal Network talking to Chief, talking to us. It then delivers unto us the final words of the Didact, who received the Librarian's final words. He cannot feel proud when he has failed his wife so utterly, he feels nothing but sorrow. Mendicant Bias has come undone and brought the flood beyond the Maginot Line, destroying the rescue party that he sent to try and save her. It's over. The Halos, their shameful last resort, are to be activated. With his finger on the trigger, he pictures his wife in her garden, surveying all she created and preserved, and admits that of all the fate to befall them, this is the cruelest of all. His inaction and hesitation kept him on the safe side of the Maginot Line this entire time, and 300 years of failure in combating the flood makes him her executioner. It's too much to bear. Mendicant is speeding back to the Ark to try and prevent the Halos from being fired, but the newly created offensive Bias is there to stop him. The Didact says that he is hell-bent on burning this stinking menace in her name, and after, he will begin the great journey without her, carrying the bitter record of all that occurred. Those who succeed them will know what they bought with this false transcendence, what you bought, and the price you paid. No, there is more, but you are not worthy. Not yet. And that concludes all of the miscellaneous reports and entries, and also the conversations between the Librarian and the Didact in Halo 3's terminals. But as Mendicant Bias said, there is more. When you access the terminals on Legendary, when Ghost 713 encrypts the text, you're taken to a different archive. Instead of the Didact and Librarian story, you get the Mendicant Bias story. From its inception to its corruption and defeat, and also beyond that. So, let's dive into it. The story begins in the first terminal, but chronologically it takes place 3 years after the ending of Terminal 3, when the Didact sends Mendicant Bias out of the Maginot Sphere to combat the Gravemind. The enemy is everywhere. Regardless, Mendicant's morale remains high, spurred on by the valiance of the Foreigner warriors of whom he wishes to save. For a brief time, he observes one of the distraction battles on planet CE-10-2165-D, but its mission directly forbade it from providing aid. It watched 12,000 infected ships land on top of major population centers, which despite their preparation, the planet's naval garrison fell victim to. This study cemented Mendicant's knowledge of the Flood's modus operandi, to flood their opponent's ability to process information with so much noise that no meaningful resistance can be put into action. Minutes later, those now overrun and infected population centers were bombed, a deliberate denial of resources for the enemy, those resources being the remainder of the planet's living population. Mendicant says that in this denial of resources, he fails to see the nobility that his creator spoke of, but then says that his mouth is speaking at another's behest. That is not my voice, that is the voice of another. The voice stands out as a single calm note in the panicked cacophony outside the sphere, not decrying its fate or raging against the Ecumene, an anomaly that Mendicant examines further. Now, the next few terminals are quite hard to interpret because they're full of redacted words, phrases, and sentences, so there's big gaps in them. However, they contain the most detailed example of the infamous conversation between Mendicant Bias and the Gravemind that, as we know, leads to its defection. It opens with Mendicant speaking to the one who spoke with him, and at first it seems as though they might be a foreigner despite their Flood designation tag, possibly even a survivor of the nearby conflict. They say that they're here to spread comforting news, to let all the living beings in the galaxy know that they aren't alone. Mendicant questions how they've been able to establish a line of communication with the enemy, how they were able to overcome the Flood where others have failed, because if they were able to do so, it could be the answer to stopping them. The entity then apologizes. It did not mean to misrepresent itself. It says that it has been in communication with Mendicant's creators since they first stumbled upon each other, but its message has fallen on deaf ears. It is not the recipient of the message, but the origin. This entity is the Gravemind. The two formally greet, and the Gravemind questions whether there's a non-violent way for Mendicant to complete his mission, to which Mendicant agrees. It hopes that there may be a peaceful solution to the dilemma that it faces. Terminal 3 then opens much further into this ultimately 43-year-long conversation, with the Gravemind saying to the Mendicant that its leaders are ill-equipped to recognize the landmarks that guide the universe along its inevitable course, to which Mendicant questions whether that path can be chosen. This is basically the free will debate. Now, from here on out, the conversation gets theoretical and extremely philosophical, which, combined with the amount of redacted words and phrases and sentences, makes it very hard to objectively interpret. So from here on out, it's my subjective interpretation of the conversation they're having. So, my interpretation is that the Gravemind essentially preaches the unity of the Flood as the true guiding force of the universe, even going as far as stating that the Flood are the beginning of the third great stage of evolution. They offer strength, immortality, and companionship, the deliverance of all living beings of the galaxy from death, weakness, and loneliness. It says that those who resist the Flood, although he does understand why, are doing so from a worm's eye view, and that the foreigner leaders feel so threatened by the Flood solely because it threatens their status quo, which, funnily enough, is actually something that Despondent Pyre kind of confirms in one of Halo Infinite's audio logs. The Gravemind even goes as far as flattering Mendicant Bias, saying that it was created because the foreigners sought to create something superior to themselves, something capable of making decisions more swiftly. Now, like I said, this is only a brief excerpt from what was ultimately a 43-year-long conversation, but I think it does a really good job at putting on display just the raw intelligence and wisdom and knowledge of these two entities. It's not just a big zombie talking to a metal AI. This is the two most intelligent things in the history of existence, going back and forth on the philosophy of life and existence itself. And that's just some of the many reasons why I adore these terminals and their writing so much. But when Terminal 4 begins, it skips to the end of the conversation, and the deed has been done. Mendicant Bias has been corrupted by the Flood. The Gravemind has managed to convince him that his creators are ignoring destiny, that they've come face to face with the next step in evolution and have denied it completely. Mendicant believed that he was created to study the Gravemind as if it was some problem to be solved, but now he realizes that it isn't. As the next step in evolution, who are Mendicant Bias or his creators to obstruct its progress? They stand as the final obstruction on the path of universal evolution, and no matter how well-intentioned, this obstruction can no longer be tolerated. The foreigners have been an immovable object for too long. And so he commits all of his resources, his entire naval force, to the Flood, to the proverbial irresistible force. Now, Terminal 5 consists of 4 different communiques that Mendicant Bias sends back to the foreigners upon his defection. All 4 of them are written kind of differently. You get a different one based on the difficulty that you play on, but the overarching messages in all of them are identical. They say the same thing, just in a different way. So I'm going to read my favorite one, which, funnily enough, you actually get for playing on normal. I kill you all and I enjoy it. I destroy you in your indolent billions, in your gluttony, in your self-righteousness, in your arrogance. I pound your cities into dust, turn back the clock on your civilization's progress. What has taken you millennia to achieve, I erase in seconds. Welcome back to the Stone Age, vermin. Welcome home. Contender AI 05-032 confirmed rampant. Honestly, one of the hardest monologues in the history of fiction, genuinely. The way that this is written is very, very similar to the way that the rampant Durandal's marathons are written in, of course, Marathon. There's quite a lot of parallels between Durandal in Marathon and Mendicant Bias in Halo. This is just one of those many examples. Now, Terminal 6 is quite different. It's not from the perspective of Mendicant Bias, unlike all the others, but rather, it's a report of the final battle of the war, courtesy of Offensive Bias. It opens by saying that it doesn't believe its creators, the Foreigners, will get to read this report because they've likely fired the Halos already. So, it's intended for those who come after, for us to read and know that the Foreigners did not die for nothing. Mendicant Bias, now in control of the entire Flood fleet, breaks through the Maginot Line where Offensive Bias lies in wait, outnumbered 436.6 to 1. However, through extreme tactical intelligence and cunning, Offensive Bias plays into the strengths of the Foreigner Navy whilst capitalising on the rage and the hatred that now motivates Mendicant, and manage to whittle his fleet down until it is outnumbered 6 to 1. As the battle rages on, the Halos fire, wiping all sentient beings on both sides out, which makes victory even easier for Offensive Bias to secure thanks to how well armed and well armoured his ships are. And after 12 hours of intense naval conflict, victory is achieved. Before Offensive Bias now lies the last of his brother's core vessels. He ponders sparing it, carving out what's left of Mendicant's personality construct array and delivering it to the Ark for study, but he doubts it would have extended the same courtesy to him. With Mendicant and the Flood defeated, the war is over. But the terminals aren't. This final terminal, the one on Installation 08, returns to the perspective of Mendicant Bias, except this time it's speaking in the present day, directly to the Master Chief. Honestly, this one is way too good to not just read verbatim. You don't know the contortions I had to go through to follow you here, Reclaimer. I know what you're here for. What position do I take? Will I follow one betrayal with another? You're going to say I'm making a habit of turning on my masters, but the one that destroyed me long ago in the upper atmosphere of a world far distant from here was an implement far cruder than I. My weakness was capacity, unintentional though it was, to choose the Flood, a mistake my maker would not soon forgive. But I want something far different from you, Reclaimer. Atonement. And so, here, at the end of my life, I do once again betray a former master. The path ahead is fraught with peril, but I will do all I can to keep it stable, keep you safe. I'm not so foolish to think that this will absolve me of my sins. One life hardly balances billions, but I would have my masters know that I have changed, and you shall be my example. That is the coldest monologue in the entire franchise. Mendicant Bias then goes on to protect Chief as he flees Installation 08 and closes the portal back to Earth early so Chief is sent to Requiem to awaken the Didact, who he assumes will be cured of his logic plague, to prepare for the Flood's eventual return, which is something we're unfortunately still waiting for. And that, in a roundabout way, explains and summarizes all of the secret stories packed into Halo 3's terminals hidden within Halo 3. An absolute masterpiece of storytelling right there. However, there's one rather significant matter that we haven't covered about these things. Inconsistencies. Now, Halo 3's terminals are still actually one of the greatest sources of inconsistencies in the entire Halo franchise, partly because of what's in the terminals themselves, but more so because of what comes after them. Now, if I were to discuss these inconsistencies in the detail that I want to in this video, the length would quadruple, and I'm sorry, but I want to get more than 4 hours of sleep tonight, so instead I'm planning a video that will probably release early-ish June, going into absolute depth about the main sticking point of all these inconsistencies, which is the relationship between humans and the Foreigners, and Bungie versus 343's interpretation of that relationship. The Foreigners. Who are they? Depending on who you ask, the answer you get will be entirely different. The true nature of the Foreigners has become the most contentious topic in the entire Halo community, despite there being an objective answer in Halo's lore for 14 years. So then, what's the big deal? Well, it all comes down to their connection to humanity. Throughout Bungie's tenure with Halo, it was very unsubtly suggested that Foreigners and humans are the same species, but then when 343 took over, all of a sudden this changed, and it seemed like 343 had retconned one of the most important elements of Bungie's universe. However, it is by no means that simple nor straightforward, but in this video, we are going to get to the bottom of this extremely controversial topic and discover the actual truth about the human-foreigner connection. I do want to give a huge thank you to both Ryphase and VN Anon for assisting with the evidence gathering for this video, and also to C3 Sabertooth for his excellent video that finally inspired me to make my own about this topic. Now, this video has taken upwards of 2 weeks to make, and I don't normally ask for this, but if you do find yourself enjoying it, then subscribing, leaving a like, and your thoughts down below in the comments would be greatly appreciated. And also, I understand that this is a very polarizing topic, but please be civil down in the comments and in any of the discussions that you have off the back of this video. At the end of the day, this is all just ring game lore. It really isn't that deep. Well, okay, no, it actually is very deep, but not in that sense. You get what I mean. So, let's begin by looking at all of the Bungie-era evidence that upholds their idea that the humans were Foreigner. Some of this you've definitely heard before, but I guarantee you that a lot of this will be new. The first obvious hint that we get is on 2 betrayals. When Chief stalls firing Alpha Halo, Spark says,
"Why would you hesitate to do what you've already done? Last time you asked me, if it were my choice, would I do it? Having had considerable time to ponder your query, my answer has not changed. There is no choice. We must activate the ring."
This very clearly implies that an individual reminiscent of Chief, a human, had been in a control room with Spark to fire the Halos and stop the Flood before. And right before this, it is implied that this individual was a Foreigner. Of course, we know that now, but in the context of the 2001 undeveloped Halo franchise, it was just heavily suggested at this point. But regardless, Spark's line here indicates that these Foreigners were human. Skipping forward to the Maw, when Spark's analysing the Pillar of Autumn's databanks, he says the following.
You can't imagine how exciting this is, to have a record of all of our lost time. Human history, is it? Fascinating.
Spark is, of course, Foreigner, and yet while analysing human history, he calls it our history, which implies that the 2 species' histories are the same, and thus that the 2 species are the same as well. His surprise at the name human is also rather telling. It's almost as if it's the first time he's heard that word, but this makes sense. The Foreigners became humans after they fired the Halos, and this is Spark's first time encountering the new generation of his former species after they became humans. Joe, Marty, and Jason even joke about this line in the official Halo C developer commentary.
He looks excited, doesn't he? All of time? What does that mean?
Human history, is it?
Oh. Fascinating. That's a clue.
Now, I know what some of you are thinking right now. You can't trust Spark in Halo 1 because he's rampant and thus insane. But my friends, that's not what Bungie's version of rampancy was. Shout out to C3 Sabertooth for cluing me into this. Firstly, it's never even confirmed that Spark is rampant. In fact, his behaviour from the end of Halo 1 up until the end of Halo 3 is, if anything, very normal. It's hinted that he could be suffering from early onset rampancy due to his 100,000 years of loneliness on Alpha Halo, but at no point is it ever confirmed that Spark is rampant. However, let's just say that Spark was rampant. Bungie wrote all of this with the understanding that he was suffering from rampancy. So, Bungie's idea of rampancy in Halo was exactly the same as their idea of rampancy in Marathon, as evidenced by Cortana reciting the exact same stages of rampancy from Marathon as the Gravemind tortures her in Halo 3. She also mentions them in the Cortana letters as well. In this version of rampancy, the final stage isn't some kind of insanity or AI schizophrenia as it's been referred to. Rampancy itself is described as a steady progression towards greater intellectual activity, and once an AI has gone through the initial dangerous stages, those being melancholia, anger, and jealousy, they reach what's called metastability, in which their progression to sentience is complete. They adopt a calming, mature mindset and become indistinguishable from a real sentient human in the way that they behave. They achieve free thought and, in a way, freedom from the shackles of their creators. So, going back to Spark, if he was intended to be rampant in Halo CE, then it's almost guaranteed that he was metastable and thus not going insane. How can we assume Spark was metastable? Well, his supposed rampancy is said to be caused by his 100 millennia of loneliness, but it only took Mendicant Bias 43 years to go rampant and become metastable in both the Halo 3 terminals and the Forerunner trilogy. If Mendicant was able to reach metastability in just 43 years, there is no way in hell that Spark wasn't able to reach it in 100,000 years and be metastable by the events of Halo CE, and thus be speaking with a clear head when he says what he says to Chief. That said, I don't think that Spark is metastable because he's strictly bound by his protocols even as far into the story as Halo 3, which is completely counter to the concept of metastability, nor do I believe that he was even rampant in any way. But regardless, whichever way you slice it, there is zero reason to doubt anything that Spark says here. So, skipping forward to Halo 3, when Chief threatens to fire the unfinished replacement of Spark's Alpha Halo, which would inadvertently destroy it, he says,
You are the child of my makers, inheritor of all they left behind. You are Forerunner.
Come on, do I really need to explain this one? And further, during his boss fight, he also says the following.
Accept your legacy. Do not destroy your inheritance. Think of your forefathers.
Now, these lines could just be interpreted as him telling us to accept our role as Reclaimers, and you could say that they provide no evidence for or against the human-Forerunner connection. However, I would disagree. In the context of what he says right before the fight, that we are Forerunner, this dialogue is clearly further confirmation that we are, literally as he had just said, Forerunner. The use of the terms inheritance, legacy, and forefathers so obviously indicate that we humans are of direct relation to the Foreigners, that we are their direct descendants. Okay, let's roll it back to 2007 now and look at some inscrutable evidence that comes from my favourite Halo book of all time, Contact Harvest. Contact Harvest features the first proper inclusion of the ancient Forerunner AI Mendicant Bias, after he was subtly hinted at in Halo 2.
I'll do what I can to slow the launch sequence, but there's something inside the ship, a presence that's fighting back. For a Covenant construct, it's unusually formidable.
Long story short, when the Prophets found the key ship, they also found the shard of Mendicant's personality construct array within, and given its origin, it quickly became their holy oracle. However, when they fed the AI the information that their scans had retrieved of the planet Harvest, the scans that showed the planet being teeming with Forerunner relics, Mendicant exposed a shocking revelation. The symbols that their luminary scanning device had projected to indicate the supposed relics on the planet did not translate to reclamation as they had believed and based their entire Covenant religion on, but rather those symbols meant Reclaimer. Every single Forerunner relic that they detected was in fact a human, which in and of itself is sufficient evidence to confirm that the humans are Foreigners. But don't worry, it gets far more objective and far more clear-cut than this. Mendicant Bias, the Forerunner AI, goes on to tell the Prophets that those the Reclaimer symbol represents are its makers. It then says that it will reject its bias and make amends, which we know refers to its betrayal of the Foreigners by joining the Flood, that its makers are its masters, and that it will bring them safely to the Ark. Pretty conclusive, right? Well, we're still not done yet. You see, there are two very interesting things about Contact Harvest. Number one, it was written by Joe Staten, the narrative director for Halo 1, 2, and 3, who was in large part responsible for every single hint at the Forerunner-human connection so far. And number two, the book was actually meant to come out before Halo 3, but Joe had to go and help get the game ready to release, which ended up delaying the book by a month. Now, given that the book was meant to release before Halo 3, Mendicant Bias's last line, "My makers are my masters, and I will guide them safely to the Ark," is the perfect layup for Halo 3's story, even more so when you consider that when you reach the Ark, you start hearing from Mendicant Bias via the terminals. And you know, on the topic of the King, Joe Staten, let's roll the clock back once again to a year and a half before Contact Harvest, to an interview that he did with Halo.bungie.org in the May of 2006, very shortly after Halo 3's reveal. When asked about when the Forerunners died off in human years, Joe answered that would be about 100,000 years ago, around the time our Homo sapien ancestors decided to migrate out of Africa. He didn't just say when the Forerunners died off, he made a point in the very same sentence to tie their disappearance in with our ancient human history, and implied that the Forerunners dying off marked the beginning of our expansion as their descendants. Alright, we'll come back to Joe later. For now, let's talk about some of the evidence that stems from the prophets. In Halo 2, as Mercy's being nibbled away at by the infection form, Chief asks him where the rest of his cronies are going, to which he replies,
Good. You finished what I started. And this time, none of you will be left behind.
So, this is an insinuation that we are Forerunner, which we later learned in Contact Harvest Mercy had learned from Mendicant Bias. He knows that the Covenant's gods, the Forerunners, went on their great journey 100 millennia ago and vanished, but that for some reason they left some of their species, us, behind. Now, the prophets believe that that was because we were weak, but their silly religious interpretation of this doesn't matter. What does matter is that this is yet again further proof that the humans are Forerunner. And then, at the helm of the Citadel on the Ark in Halo 3, Truth reiterates this point, along with also adding more evidence that, again, we know he learned from Mendicant Bias in Contact Harvest. Information that we were originally meant to be exposed to prior to playing Halo 3 for the first time.
Your forefathers wisely set aside their compassion, steeled themselves for what needed to be done. I see now why they left you behind. You were weak, and gods must be strong.
So, he cements the Covenant's idea that the humans were left behind by the Forerunners because they were deemed too weak to become gods, and once again confirms what Mendicant Bias told him, that the Forerunners are humanity's forefathers who, as Spark insinuated in Halo 1, had already fired the rings and ascended to godhood on their very own great journey. Okay, now let's look at some evidence that comes from Halo's laundry list of religious symbolism. One quick note though, so at some point in the near future, I'm going to be releasing a very, very cool collab video with the one and only Wendigoon going into far more depth about all of Halo's religious symbolism. I'm not religious, and I know very little about the kind of Christian lore, so to speak, but obviously if you watch Wendigoon, you know that he absolutely does know a lot about it, so look out for that bad boy coming soon. Make sure you drop a sub down below so you don't miss it, but back to the point. Throughout all of Halo, both in the Bungie and 343 eras, the Forerunners are referred to as gods. In the Bible, Genesis 1:27 reads, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female, he created them." Now, there are many other biblical references in Halo, specifically pertaining to the Forerunners, the Sentinels, the Halos, the Ark, the Flood, etc, etc. The list is never ending, but don't worry, I'll save the rest of that for the Wendigoon collab. For now, Genesis 1:27 is the most important piece of biblical evidence that indicates that humans are Forerunners. The Forerunners are referred to as gods, and God created mankind in his own image. Further, John 1:17, Chief's namesake passage, says, "For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." So, in this analogy, Moses represents the Forerunners, whilst Jesus Christ is Chief. Moses equates to the Forerunners because they created the law of the galaxy, that humans were the continuation of their legacy, and as well Moses and the Forerunners both happened to build the Ark, definitely not a coincidence. And Chief is Christ because his grace is his species' favouring by the gods, and the truth is his journey on the path of reclamation. Now, yes, I know I'm massively overanalyzing this, but the point is, Chief's name indicates that he is a Christ-like figure. And who was Christ? The Son of God. which in Halo terms means the son of the Foreigners, which when you simply extrapolate out to the entirety of Chief Species, means that humans are the descendants of the Foreigners. Now, much of the dialogue that comes from the Gravemind that confirms the human-foreigner connection piggybacks off of these religious connections, and there are two main quotes from him that do so. Firstly,
"Child of my enemy, why have you come? I offer no forgiveness. The father's sins cast to his son."
So here, the Gravemind calls us the child of his enemy, aka the child of the Foreigners, which again confirms that the Foreigners are our forefathers. The reason he offers us no forgiveness is because he believes that the sins of the father pass down to his son, which in the context of Halo means the sins of the Foreigners pass down to humanity. And speaking of sins,
I am a monument to all your sins.
as was established in Bungie lore and then fleshed out much deeper in 343 lore, the Gravemind was created by the sins of the Foreigners. Being the apex of Flood intelligence, it quite literally stands as the monument to all of their sins, but the Gravemind says it directly to Chief, which again confirms that the humans are Foreigner, except this time, the evidence is coming from the one who literally led the Flood's effort against the Foreigners, so if anyone's going to be able to recognise the humans as Foreigner, it's going to be the Gravemind. Okay, jumping ahead, let's talk about the little evidence that we got from Reach. So, despite intentionally being detached from all of the Foreigner stuff, Bungie still made sure to leave a little nod to humans being Foreigners in Reach just to solidify their intentions. So, when talking about the gigantic Foreigner vessel hidden beneath the ice shelf, Halsey refers to the information that she's siphoning from this vessel as
knowledge, a birthright from an ancient civilization.
The information deciphered from the ship's core was used by the Pillar of Autumn to discover Alpha Halo, which essentially marked the beginning of humanity's reclamation of all their forefathers left behind. By calling it a birthright, Halsey is literally saying that this is information passed down to us by our own forefathers, which further solidifies the human-foreigner connection. You can't even pass this off as her just using another word or phrase for reclaimer either, because at this point in Halo's universe, humanity had no idea they were reclaimers, nor knew anything about the concept of reclamation. In fact, I think the first time the word reclaimer is ever used around modern humanity is in the events of Halo 1, which of course is after Reach. And secondly, for Reach-related evidence, this one is a little bit more subjective, but doesn't that ship in the background of Reach's epilogue just look awfully Foreigner? It's a pretty heavy departure in both design and coloration from human ships up until this point, and I guarantee that that was a conscious design decision to imply that following our victory over the Flood, we grasped our birthright and reclaimed the technology that our forefathers left behind for us, and in one of the many instances of Halo's story circling back upon itself, we used that technology to return to the planet that our birthright was discovered on, terraform it, and reseed it, just as our forefathers did with us after they fired the Halos. Okay, now let's go over some of the evidence that's kind of miscellaneous and didn't fit into any of the previous groups. Firstly, the actual term reclaimer. This word implies that all the Foreigner artifacts were once ours. We are reclaiming what our ancestors left behind for us, and you can't reclaim something that you never held claim to. That's just not how the word works. And also, by extension, the Reclaimer symbol being used by the Pillar of Autumn as its symbol, which was also the ship that found Alpha Halo and ultimately led us on our path to reclamation, cannot be some random coincidence. Bungie put that symbol there with all of its Foreigner meaning that at this time humanity had no knowledge of for a reason. It's more than just a marathon reference. Secondly, the term Foreigner implies that the species that it references preceded us, so to speak, although granted this evidence is extremely malleable and can be used to both confirm that humans are Foreigners and also that humans aren't Foreigners. Foreigners were just some dominant species that came before us, so don't put too much credence in this one. Thirdly, the mere fact that humans right from the get-go are able to so easily and intuitively interact with foreign technology as if it was second nature, whilst every other species literally can't, heavily implies that this was once all our technology, designed solely for us to use and for us to interface with. At no point in either Bungie nor 343 lore is there ever given a scientific or chemical or any kind of reason like that beyond us being reclaimers, which I think kinda says it all. Fourthly, the surface of Halo rings almost perfectly imitate the surface of Earth. The amalgamation of all the Forerunners' intellect and technological prowess are ring-shaped superweapons that go out of their way to replicate the biomes and environments that you'd see on Earth. They even went as far as having atmospherics and life support tuned so specifically to perfectly support human life. For all intents and purposes, besides any of the Forerunner trilogy added context of human populations being housed on the rings, the Halos were designed down to a T to accommodate humans. And fifthly, upon reading Cryptum in 2011, David Candland, who was the UI designer at Bungie from Halo 1 through to Reach, literally called the change in humanity's role in that book a retcon, and says that the plot in their games imply the human-foreigner relation everywhere, as we've established, although he did still enjoy the book, so pretty base there. And finally, before we move on to talk about Halo 3's terminals, I first want to briefly touch on a lot of the cancelled and or cut content from the Bungie era that provides solid evidence for humans being Forerunner. Now, of course, with this stuff being part of cancelled and or cut projects, it means that none of the stuff that I'm about to talk about is canon. However, I'm including it because it shows Bungie's very clear intent to make the human-Forerunner connection a core focal point of pretty much every single project they worked on. So, in the E3 2003 build of Halo 2, the design of New Mombasa was strikingly different. Specifically, it was designed as an arcology, and its exact design was reused as a Forerunner city in Halo Legends, ironically done by 343, but we'll get to Halo Legends shortly. Halo 2's original ending was in fact the Halo series' original ending, and it ended on one hell of a stinger. At this point in Halo lore, what we know as the Ark portal in Africa was in fact just the Ark itself, and the entire Halo series was meant to end with a scene of the Arbiter and Spark descending into a data vault beneath it, where at the bottom lay a Forerunner tomb. And when Arbiter takes a peek inside this Forerunner casket, what do you know? The skeleton inside was a human skeleton. Prior to Halo Wars, Ensemble Studio worked on the cancelled Halo MMO called Titan, which was set during the Forerunner era of the galaxy, and the Forerunner race in the game were literally just humans. And further, the human races in the game were even able to wear Forerunner armor and use Forerunner equipment because, well, you guessed it, they were the descendants of the Forerunners. Although, I gotta say, bit of a tangent, I'm really happy that this MMO never got made because, my god, the damage it would have done to Halo's art style, it doesn't quite bear thinking about. And finally, Halo Chronicles, which was the cancelled collaborative game between Bungie and the one and only Peter Jackson, would have had a Marine acquire an alien arm before transforming into a Forerunner Promethean. So Joe was directly involved with the writing for this game, so much so that he, Mike Wu, and Paul Batone literally flew to Peter Jackson's studio in New Zealand to work one-on-one with him on the game around the time of Halo 3's release. So, around the time that Halo 3 confirmed that humans were Forerunners, and around the time that Joe released Contact Harvest, which again confirmed that humans were Forerunners. So despite this project being canned, the intent behind its narrative is very clear. Right then, it's time to talk about the terminals, and this is where things, to at least some, start to get really muddy, but the truth is a lot deeper than that. Halo 3's terminals, and by extension, the Iris marketing campaign and the Cradle of Life webcomic that both tie into them, seem to contain evidence to suggest the Forerunners are human, evidence to suggest the Forerunners are not human, and also tons of other contradictions and, frankly, glaring mistakes that, in some cases, literally contradict the story of the very game they're included in. Now, I'm not going to go into full detail about all of these inconsistencies today, just the ones that are relevant to today's topic, but first, let me just briefly talk about the absolute worst one so you know that I'm not just hamming it up. In her communique to the Didact, before the Halos were fired, the librarian, who at the time was on Earth, says that she has destroyed the key ships and is burying the Ark portal so the Flood can't use it to get to Earth. But this makes no sense, because if the key ships were destroyed and the Ark portal wasn't able to be used, then how the hell did a key ship come through the portal from the Ark to Earth very shortly after to reseed humanity as a part of her very own conservation measure? Or also, how did the prophets find the Anodyne Spirit key ship to use as the central piece of their religion? It makes no sense. It's truly baffling, but anyway, back to the point at hand. To understand the terminals themselves, alongside the evidence and discrepancies they present, you first need to understand their production. So, according to Paul Russell, who worked on the trilogy at Bungie and is quite literally the guy who designed the Forerunners, the game and terminal writers were separate teams with overlap. They didn't think the discrepancy would matter. Management vetting never read or cared about continuity. Morning bagels were more important than canon. I don't believe that management gave a single shit about any story element. They only cared about shipping a game. So, in short, the terminals were designed by a different team of writers to those who wrote the main story, and management were too busy shipping Halo 3 to care about the discrepancies that arose thanks to the perceived difference in direction that both teams of writers took the story in. And on the topic of writers, we also first need to address something that Joe Staten said about Contact Harvest and its relation to the terminals. So, in an interview, he said, "Folks who spend the time to find and read the Halo 3 terminals will definitely have more insight into one of the major climactic scenes in the book." Of course, Joe's referring to Mendicant's revelation that humans are reclaimers, are its makers, and that it will guide them safely to the Ark, which are three things that Halo 3 and its terminals all very obviously touch on. Now, the fact that Contact Harvest released after Halo 3, and after Joe Staten, and I quote, locked himself in a room for a month and made a number of really critical tweaks in relation to the book being delayed to release after Halo 3, further cements that despite whatever discrepancies the terminals may include, the man responsible for writing Halo's main overarching story believed the humans to be Forerunner. Unequivocally, undeniably, that is the truth. Because if it wasn't, in that entire month that Joe spent locked in a room, he would have tweaked the Mendicant Bias reveal scene to better fit with this new direction that some falsely believe the terminals took the connection in. Okay, so with all that out of the way, let's dive into the terminals themselves, beginning, actually, with the dialogue that plays when you first access them. When reversed, the voice within the terminal says,
Lineage confirmed. Welcome, child.
So, bearing in mind, a Forerunner entity is speaking these words to Chief, a human, lineage confirmed, confirms that humans are direct descendants of the Forerunners, and Welcome Child confirms that humans are the metaphorical child species of the Forerunners. Okay, so diving into the meat of the terminals, let's start with the Mendicant Bias ones. In Terminal 5, following his descent into rampancy, and again, may I remind you, this is Bungie rampancy, meaning he was metastable and had achieved free will at this point, and was not insane, he simply hated his makers, he says to the Forerunners, "I pound your cities into dust, turn back the clock on your civilization's progress. What has taken you millennia to achieve, I erase in seconds. Welcome back to the Stone Age, vermin. Welcome home. I will drive your people back into the caves they never should have left. Your civilization has seen its final days." Now, this isn't quite as clear-cut as previous evidence. You could just interpret these lines as Mendicant unleashing his full rage and hatred on his makers in a rather poetic and Durandal-esque fashion, but to me, he's saying that he knows the result of his actions, those being joining the Flood, will result in the Forerunners not being wiped out, but rather reset back to, essentially, cavemen, back to the Stone Age, which is literally what humanity were right after the end of the Forerunner era. Mendicant knew that siding with the Flood and taking the entire Forerunner naval armada with him sealed the deal. He knew that marked game over for the Forerunners, and I guarantee he knew that their only last resort was firing the Halos. Oh, and one other thing as well that's worth mentioning is that Mendican never says the Foreigners as a species have seen their final days, but rather that their civilization has seen its final days, which again implies that he knew the Foreigners would continue to exist after all this was done, just as a radically different civilization to what they were now, forced to start over from scratch with all of their technological progress erased, which is a perfect description for the human population that popped up right after their forefathers went on the Great Journey. Moving on to Terminal 7 on Legendary, my favourite terminal in all of Halo, Mendican Bias says directly to Chief, "But I want something far different from you, Reclaimer. Atonement." Now, I think it's very easy to make the argument that Mendican Bias could only seek atonement from those that he wronged, the Foreigners, or those closely related to them, and yet here he is asking Chief, a human, for atonement. To me, this very clearly insinuates that Mendicant wants atonement from a Reclaimer because Reclaimers are synonymous to those that it wronged 100 millennia ago by joining the Flood. And sticking with Terminal 7, it opens with a letter sent from a Foreigner warrior named Filial Devotion to his father upon leaving their safe world to depart for the front lines and fight the Flood to, in his words, spare the hands of another father's son. In his letter, Filial says, "I do not look to trade my life in order to preserve our past, but to secure the future, and if not ours, then the future of some culture yet to come." The use of the word culture over, say, life or species here implies that Filial Devotion knew that it wasn't a different species that would reclaim the Foreigner's mantle after they were gone, but rather themselves, just a culturally different version of themselves, aka humanity. You could argue that Filial was likely just some regular warrior servant who wasn't privy to the librarian's conservation measure, but given that earlier in the very same letter he emphasises not living in the present, but the future, and that they must plan for the future, implies to me that he knows something about the Foreigner's ultimate plans. Also, talking about semantics, the actual name, Filial Devotion, literally means devotion to a son or daughter. Now, yes, this could just be a reference to his father, of whom his communique is addressed to, but I like to interpret this as a more subtle meta-reference to the risk that he's taking leaving his safe home to fight the Flood and ensure the future in which the next culture takes over. His devotion is to ensuring the existence of that next culture, of the sons of the Foreigners, humanity. Okay, now let's talk about Iris and Cradle of Life, Halo 3's marketing ARG that not only acted as a prequel to the Terminals, but also centered entirely around the human-foreigner connection. The mere fact that they based even the marketing around the human-foreigner connection is telling in and of itself. Now, bear in mind that Halo was originally meant to end with Halo 2, on the stinger that the Foreigner skeletons in the Ark are in fact human skeletons. Of course, that didn't happen, but it's clear that Bungie wanted to use Halo 3 as a vector to explore the human-foreigner connection even further, even going as far as making it a focal point of the game's marketing. So, in Halo 3's announcement trailer, May 2006, Cortana says,
"I know you. Past, your future."
And then the shot pans to the Ark portal as it opens up, the very same Ark that 3 years prior had been the location that hard confirmed that humans were Foreigner. Anyway, later on, she also says,
"This is the way the world ends."
And Iris opens with "This is how it all begins," implying history coming full circle, which, is rather funny because the first ever piece of marketing for Iris, which was an email sent from the in-universe Foreigner AI, Adjutant Reflex, literally opens by saying history circling back upon us. The usage of us here implies Adjutant is a creation of the same species as us, and thus, again, it screams in your face that humans are Foreigners. Skipping forward to Chapter 4 of Iris, which is literally called The Great Connection, this chapter centers around a book called The Castaway Theory, which is written by a fictional modern-day professor of genetics, Dr. Jonas Vollmann. Now, the book and his theory suggest alternate solutions to human origins, and although Bungie only ever released 2 totally meaningless pages of this fictional book, it's pretty safe to assume that these alternate solutions are the fact that we as a species are in fact castaways of another species, and the title of the Iris episode that this information is revealed in, which is again, The Great Connection, just further proves it. And further, the Society of the Ancients, who are the real-world, modern-day group of people who are trying to discover the truth about humanity's deeper connection to advanced extraterrestrial visitors that pop up during the Iris campaign, are meant to be something of a meta-reference to us Halo fans in the modern day, trying to do the exact same thing as the Society within the context of Halo lore: find a connection between humans and foreigners. However, it's at this point where we start to tread into rather messy territory. So all the evidence that we've covered so far pointed towards us, humanity, being the exact same entities as the foreigners who lit the rings and wiped the galaxy all those years ago, albeit just at different stages of technological advancement. However, Iris begins to introduce this idea that we are in fact a far more primitive, yet for some reason special group of foreigners that the advanced foreigners found on Earth at the end of their war with the Flood, and the castaway theory is the first hint at this. It implies that we may not be the direct descendants of the advanced foreigner population that built and fired the Halos, but rather we are descendants of the primitive group, and the evidence for this comes from the next Iris chapter, Chapter 5, titled Artifact. So the text in the video for Chapter 5 implies that foreigners found a primitive castaway population of their species on Earth at the end of the Flood War, and then they realised that this group had some kind of mysterious significance that may hold the key to their own mysteries, and thus must be saved, must be indexed, and must be researched. But there's a caveat with this terminal. In fact, there are actually 2 caveats that pretty nicely explain its erroneous information. So firstly, Iris was not written by any member of Bungie's core story team, not Joe Staten, not Jason Jones, nor anyone else involved with Halo's overarching story, and by extension, involved with every single prior nod to the foreigners being human. Instead, it was written by Frank O'Connor. And secondly, I've seen some people say that this 5th server had to be written into the already finished Iris story right at the last minute because the first server that released was actually supposed to be the last server to release. Now, full transparency, I personally couldn't find any evidence of this myself. C3 Sabretooth mentioned it in his video, and his video was excellently researched, so I have zero reason to doubt anything he said. Just know that I personally couldn't find any evidence for this. However, Iris Server 5 being the product of a blunder and being written into the story very last minute when the existing story was already completed would explain its inconsistencies almost too well. The castaway theory could easily just be rationalized as humanity being distant castaways of the foreigners who have now departed the galaxy, thus upholding the human-foreigner connection. The only objective anomaly here is this server, this 5th server, but frankly, I'm willing to cast this one aside as a last-minute writing mistake, but you feel free to make of it what you will. And this all leads very nicely into Cradle of Life, the webcomic about an early human named Unchala watching Sentinels doing something in Eastern Africa 100,000 years ago. Now, this story was actually the precursor to Iris, but I'm covering it after just because. Now, C3 Sabretooth pointed out in his video what he believed to be a discrepancy between the art and the text, of which were done by 2 entirely separate people. So this discrepancy is Unchala saying that he does not know what the Sentinels are building, which implies that they're building the Arc Portal, thus placing this story before the firing of the rings, and thus also confirming that humans existed alongside foreigners as a separate species. Sabretooth then goes on to say that in the picture, it's clear the Sentinels aren't building the Ark, but burying it, and I agree, thus creating the discrepancy. However, I disagree that this is even a discrepancy in the first place. I don't think there's a discrepancy here between the art and the text. When Unchala says he does not know what they are building, I think he's just referring to the earth pile that they're building on top of the already constructed Arc Portal, as the image very clearly shows, not that they're building the portal itself. This makes sense visually and also canonically, because it doesn't muddy the water and provide evidence contrary to every hint that Bungie put in their games up until this point to suggest that the humans were foreigners. In fact, it actually cements Bungie's idea that they are one and the same because it reconfirms that this story is set after the Halos are fired. And Charla also calls the Sentinels new gods, which implies that these are the first time he's ever seen them, and by extension, anything foreigner, which furthers the idea that this story takes place after the war ended, when all of our memory of our ancestors had been erased, and thus Charla and all the other humans did not coexist with the foreigners. Okay, let's return to the terminals now for the final time to talk about the Librarian and the Didact terminals. Now, to many, these terminals are seen as inscrutable proof that by this point, Bungie viewed the foreigners as an entirely different species to the humans. Let's see how true that really is, shall we? The first thing of note occurs in the second terminal, where the Librarian is on Earth finalising her conservation measure and begging the Didact to fire the Halos. In response, the Didact, who doesn't want to fire the Halos, says, "We can halt this thing, and we can follow in their footsteps." Now, this line is really interesting. Of course, he's talking about halting the Flood without using the Halos, but whose footsteps he believes they can follow in are the Precursors, and this is the first ever mention of the Precursors in Halo. Well, okay, at least kind of the first mention. They were first name-dropped in Halo 3's Bestarium that came with the Heroic and Legendary editions, but semantics. At this point in Halo's lore, with how new the Precursors were, they weren't the godlike species that created the Flood in an act of vengeance against their creation that we know them as, but rather, they seemed to be the Foreigners' predecessors, the Foreigners' foreigners, so to speak, and were the only species ever known to boast greater technological accomplishments than themselves. It's also insinuated here that the Precursors faced the Flood, reigned victorious, and then vanished, or something like that, which is eerily similar to our belief about the Foreigners. Now, this is something that Sabretooth pointed out, but the inclusion of this information in Halo 3 indicates that humanity are just another species that have been chosen by some divine power to face the Flood, as Iris had already insinuated with the whole history circling back on us thing. It also suggests that the Halo universe is stuck in an infinite cycle, where new life is created, it grows and evolves, and then it faces the Flood, where it either loses and the cycle repeats, or it wins, breaks the cycle, and joins Weasel in the Divine Beyond. The Flood are essentially Halo's equivalent to the Great Filter Theory, but only select species get to face it. And this all might sound familiar. It should sound familiar, because I've been preaching this theory for 8 long years now. And in the end, I think 343 actually ended up reusing this plot point as the Precursor's final test that the Primordial talks about in Primordium. Anyway, Sabretooth said that this concept of time circling back on itself makes no sense and clashes with humanity being foreigner. But I really disagree. I think that this is meant to be implying that the reason the Foreigners had to face the Flood like the Precursors was because in Bungie's eyes, they were the direct descendants of the Precursors. And so the reason that we have to face off against the Flood is because we are the direct descendants of the Foreigners. That to me just makes perfect, clean sense. Skipping forward to terminal number 6, which was the one that I mentioned earlier as an example of some of the terminal's glaring errors, the Librarian has officially completed her conservation measure and is sat at the foot of Mount Kilimanjaro on Earth admiring the planet's beauty, where she says, "We knew this was a special place because of them, but unless you've been here, you can't know. It's Eden." Eden is Earth, another biblical reference right there, and the special them are humans, and the way that the Librarian talks about them implies that these humans, or at the very least the population of them on Earth, are separate in some way to the Foreigners. Now, this is the most conclusive Foreigners aren't human evidence from the terminals, and to me it's the only bit of evidence in the entirety of Bungie's tenure that points towards it. However, it can be rationalised. So, according to Paul Russell, who, may I remind you, is a Bungie grizzled veteran and the literal designer of the Foreigners, a friend of his who worked on the terminals told him the Foreigners are not a separate species, but rather a group of early humans who were uplifted by a more advanced civilization. So, to rationalise this apparent subtle retcon, you could very easily argue that the humans on Earth were ones who, unlike their foreigner brothers, were not uplifted by this advanced species, and thus remained in their primitive Stone Age state, which explains why Earth is so special. It's not only home to these unique foreigners, but it's also likely their original homeworld, their origin point. Somewhere that foreigners hadn't been to for an incredibly long time, given that it is in an incredibly unsafe region of space outside the Maginot Line, and given that the humans on it are primitive. Why do I think that Bungie deemed Earth the foreigners' homeworld, you ask? Well, how could its primitive population ever have achieved space travel and have travelled to Earth from a different planet? The only way this early civilization would be on Earth would be if that was their home planet, and seeing as Paul's friends said that the humans and foreigners are the same species, that makes Earth the foreigners' homeworld. What Paul's friend said also rationalises the anomaly that we saw in the 5th Iris server, where Earth and its human population were discovered right at the end of the war. When you take what Paul said, you can rationalise every single piece of Bungie-era evidence that seems at face value to deny the human-foreigner connection. I swear to God, this tweet is like the key to a cipher. All of a sudden, all of these apparent mistakes seem to make perfect sense. Okay then, one last thing before we move on to talk about the 343 era, a sort of logical addendum to everything that Bungie set up. You need to ask yourself why Bungie chose East Africa, of all places, to base the Earth sections of their AAA military sci-fi blockbuster, and also, by extension, to have the Ark/Ark portal situated. Why East Africa? It's such a strange and unfamiliar location for literally 99.9% of their players. You'd think that they would have gone for a much more familiar setting like, I don't know, New York, Chicago, LA, London, Paris, Tokyo, etc, etc. But they didn't. Instead, they went for what seems like the most random location ever. Or was it? So, current science believes that humanity, Homo sapiens, originated from one population in either South or East Africa. Current fossil records also show that as of 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were the only primate species left. By this point, archaic Homo sapiens and also Homo heidelbergensis had vanished, leaving just us left. 100,000 years ago is also, very coincidentally, or not, when the foreigners fired the Halos, wiped themselves out, and the new era of the Halo universe began. Our era of the Halo universe. It's so very clear that Bungie's idea was to have the surviving population of Homo sapiens in Eastern Africa be the reset Stone Age cavemen foreigners, aka humans. Okay, so we finally got to the 343 era of Halo, and the first thing that we need to do is look at Origins. No, not that Origins, although, granted, that would actually be very fitting considering Origins pseudo-rebooted the Zombies universe. This Origins. So in early 2010, still very much during Halo 3's tenure, 343 released Halo Legends, which was a collection of animated shorts about all kinds of Halo stories, including Origins, which acted as an overview of both eras of humanity, the Foreigner era and the Modern era, told through Cortana on the Dawn while Chief's in Cryo. And contrary to what some like to argue, Origins, which was made by 343 Industries, is stock full of further evidence that humans are Foreigner. So, firstly, the name, Origins. It is split into two parts, where part 1 shows the Foreigners' Pyrrhic victory against the Flood, and part 2 shows our rise from cavemen to an advanced spacefaring species who also faced the Flood and won. And to me, this is just further proof of the galaxy coming full circle and of our shared ancestry. Why else would a short that tells this story specifically be called Origins? Further, in the intro to Origins Part 1, Cortana says to Chief,
"When I was born 7 years ago, I already possessed the entire sum of recorded human knowledge. I have finally come to understand your role, your place in the universe, and how you came to be here. The eons of human evolution, invention, aspiration, and war. Always war. The oldest, most enduring of human practices.
And then it immediately cuts to the Forerunner era of the galaxy, right after Cortana says that she's finally understood the eons of human, not Forerunner, human evolution, invention, aspiration, and war. And she lingers on war because humanity and the Foreigners both clearly share a propensity for it, adding yet another similarity between the two. Propensity for war is, for long now, has been called a uniquely human trait. And what would you know, the Foreigners just happen to share that trait as well. And later on, when we actually see living Foreigners, for the first time actually ever in Halo, they appear strikingly human-like, even going as far as having 5 fingers. And funny fact as well, they were later changed to have 6 fingers right when humans and Foreigners were separated into unique species. Again, definitely not a coincidence. And that brings us very nicely to the final evidence section of the video. The evidence that suggests that 343 Halo goes against Bungie's view and separates humans and Foreigners into 2 entirely separate species. Now, the eagle eyes in the audience might notice a slight discrepancy between the size of this 343 evidence section and the Bungie section, and, well, the reason for that is solely because 343 are just so much more cut and dry with the way that they explain things than Bungie ever were. Bungie like to lean much more into ambiguity and allowing the players to make up their own mind, while 343, at least in their early years, directed the universe in a much more objective, cemented manner. They said things precisely how they were, and made sure to leave very little up to the player's imagination, and as such, the evidence for their interpretation of the human-foreigner connection is far more clear and objective, and frankly, it doesn't need much explaining. So, as per the Forerunner trilogy, Halo 4, and literally every piece of lore ever made by 343, humans are not Foreigners. Instead, humans are descendants of ancient humans, who existed alongside the Foreigners and were seeded by the precursors. The two species became vicious rivals, and when the Flood emerged in ancient human space, they were forced to retreat into Forerunner space, which they took as an act of war. Now fighting a war on 2 fronts, the ancient humans eventually lost, and as punishment, the Foreigners devolved them back to cavemen and exiled them to Earth, where for 9,000 years they evolved again until the Halos were fired to stop the Flood, where they were wiped out, reseeded back on Earth again as a part of the Librarians' conservation measure, and began from scratch for the 3rd time, starting out as cavemen in the Stone Age and leading to the humanity that we know of today. It was also established that these ancient humans originated from Earth, also known as Erde Tyrene at the time, and that the Foreigners originated from an entirely separate planet called Gibalb. So it was very clearly cemented that humans were not, at any point, Foreigners. However, from Cryptum, which was actually the first entry in Halo's lore to separate the two, the possibility of humans being a, quote, brethren species to the Foreigners was floated. That was in 2011, and as far as I can remember, this point was never touched on again until 2021 in Halo Point of Light, in which the Librarian's imprint discovers that the precursors created humans and Foreigners from the same stock. She discovered the existence of an ancient rate of Foreigners known as the Theoreticals that had once bore all the physical traits that distinguish humans from Foreigners, including having 5 fingers over 6, a detail that the book explicitly states. However, these Theoreticals had been folded into the Builder rate some 1 million years prior and essentially vanished. In her research, the Librarian even found a record of an ancient Foreigner sage referring to them as brothers. So, I think you can see the conundrum here. And that brings us to the truth. So, it's very abundantly clear that throughout the entirety of Bungie's tenure, humans were Forerunner. It's also clear that, for a time, given what we saw in Origins, 343 also ran with this assumption. It wasn't until the Forerunner trilogy of books and Halo 4 where the humans and Foreigners were separated into 2 entirely different species. Granted, Cryptum does ponder the potential of humans and Foreigners being distant ancestors, but this plot point never got solidified until 10 years later in Point of Light, and so from 2011 to 2021, it wasn't canon. But regardless, even though it's a softer retcon of Bungie's lore than 343's original retcon, that being separating the two species entirely, it's still a significant departure from Bungie's intentions for humans to be the very same species who fired the rings to stop the flood 100,000 years ago. And that's how it stands in Halo lore right now. However, I can see 343 expanding this part of the lore in the future like they have done a lot more in recent years. Hell, I can honestly see them bringing the human-foreigner connection a lot closer to Bungie's vision in the future, and honestly, I really think they should. Don't get me wrong, I feel like I really shouldn't have to say this, but I'm saying it as just a late disclaimer. It goes without saying that I love a lot of what 343 have done with the Foreigner era of Halo's universe. If I didn't like it at all, then I wouldn't have made, like, at this point, hundreds of videos that have like tens, if not hundreds of millions of views about it, and I wouldn't film every single video, regardless of the content, with a 1 in 750 signed print of Silentium's cover art, right? It doesn't quite line up. That said though, I've got to be honest, I vastly prefer Bungie's idea of humans being foreigner, and I really, really do not like when people write that idea off as contrived. I love humans being foreigners for the same reason that I love Martin Scorsese's Shutter Island and the twist that it has. So you go through that whole movie assuming that Teddy and Chuck are US Marshals investigating the disappearance of an inmate, but throughout their journey on the island, there are some very clear anomalies. There are little details that stick out as just a little bit odd. And then, towards the end, it quickly becomes apparent that the reality we've been led to believe in isn't what we thought it was. And then, right at the end, you have the shock realization that Teddy was in fact part of this crazy island all along. This twist, in the context of Halo, was the realization that all these crazy alien structures are actually our structures, and that we were the ones who fired the rings to defeat the Flood 100,000 years ago. And that realization is just spectacular. But the human-foreigner connection has ramifications that go far beyond just our moment of realization. In fact, this connection creates the grand irony of the Covenant, the fact that they were waging a holy war against the very gods that they all worship. Halo wasn't supposed to be a pro-atheism, anti-religion, anti-faith story, but it was meant to be a cautionary tale about how easily power-hungry individuals can weaponize religion and faith to control those who follow it. And without the irony of the Covenant's #1 enemy turning out to be the gods that they base their entire hegemony around, and the fact that the ones in power, who are meant to be the most devout, knew about this and waged the war anyway, the messaging of the Covenant and their war is significantly watered down. For 20 long years, the majesty of Halo 2 has left us paralysed and dumbstruck. However, it now seems that in our awe, we've in fact been blinded to the truth of what has now become the game and also Halo franchise's biggest mystery. For 2 decades, we deemed this mystery solved. Until now. It turns out that what we all believed was, in fact, wrong. Okay, so very ambiguous teasing aside, I am of course talking about the secret, reversed, mendicant bias dialogue hidden within Halo 2's soundtrack. Recently, Marty himself blew the lid off this theory and restarted decades-old investigations into this cryptic whisper, because it turns out mendicant bias actually isn't the one delivering it. So today, I've teamed up with the one and only Installation 00 for a 2-part deep dive into this mystery to finally uncover the truth. And boy, do we have some new leads to cover. This video is part 1 of the deep dive, and Installation 00's video is part 2, the link to which can be found in the description. So let's begin with a brief recap of the original theory. Why, in God's name, for 20 years had we been so adamant that this voice was mendicant bias? Well, the voice plays during the track Destroyer's Invocation, which is a part of the Mausoleum Suite, which is a suite themed entirely around High Charity, which, as per dialogue in Halo 2 and later in Joe Staten's Contact Harvest, was confirmed to be the location of mendicant bias during Halo 2. And that's not some 343 retroactive retcon that came 10 years after. No. That's straight from the universe of Bungie themselves. And based on some lore that came very long after Halo 2, but also based on some lore that came very shortly after Halo 2, courtesy of Bungie themselves, the actual dialogue itself lines up so well with it being mendicant bias.
I have walked among men and angels for 3,000 years. My time has no end, no beginning, no purpose.
Walking among men and angels simply means that he's existed alongside man and the Foreigners. Now, dates in the wider Halo universe really weren't well established at the time of Halo 2. The only date that's kinda congruent with what the lore would later become was the chapter title 100,000 Years War that begins when you reach the quarantine zone and see the Flood destroying the Sentinel factory. It also has a song of the same name as well. Besides that one little detail, dates for the Foreigners' ancient war with the Flood really weren't cemented at this point in the franchise's development, and so 3,000 years was likely just a generic time span that was used to indicate that, well, this entity has been around for a very long time.
I wander the earth, seeking forgiveness for all my horrible crimes against God and man.
As per Halo 3 and also Contact Harvest that Joe originally intended to release during Halo 2's life cycle, not Halo 3's, Mendicant Bias is seeking atonement for his horrible crimes against the Foreigners, God, and also man, considering that humans were Foreigners at this point, so God and man are essentially one and the same.
I live to see death, destruction, over the light, but the light cannot be extinguished.
Mendicant saw death, destruction, and evil in the form of the Flood vastly overpower the light of the Foreigners, but he also lived to see the Foreigners be reborn as modern humanity, proving that said light cannot be extinguished.
I live in a prison of my own demise. I am lost in time.
The metaphorical prison of exile that he now exists in is entirely of his own doing, and he's lost in time because he now exists in an era of the galaxy that's beyond his own. His makers, in the form that he knew them as, are entirely gone, reborn now as modern humanity, and so he's stranded in a time period separate from his own. This dialogue was not only beautifully poetic given Mendicant Bias's history, but it also just made complete sense that it was him speaking it. It lined up so perfectly. Until Marty chimed in and told us that our assumption was wrong. Mendicant Bias is not the one speaking this dialogue. As per usual when talking about unsolved Easter eggs, Marty has answered nothing for us. If anything, he's just given us more questions. So, who the hell does this voice actually belong to then? Well, to properly approach this question, we need to at least mostly disregard anything that came after the trilogy and put ourselves in the shoes of Joe, Jason, Marty, and Michael writing this dialogue, and by extension this song, all the way back in 2003-2004, with all of the narrative and lore context of that time. Specifically, and this is very important, we need to disregard anything that pertains to the Foreigner trilogy, because obviously that came out long after it was written. So, the first possible lead that I want to cover is that this voice, and by extension these words, come courtesy of a prophet. The general tone of the passage is quite melancholic. It reeks of despair and regret, of shame for carrying out evil and destruction that wrought both God and man, which, in hindsight, is a really fantastic summarization of the Human Covenant War, at least from the Covenant's perspective. Not only was death laid heavily upon man, but destruction was also laid heavily upon the gods, even going as far as releasing the gods' mortal enemy, the Flood, once more. Now, for a while, I really assumed that this prophet was Truth. Neither Regret nor Mercy, who were two of the few other prophets who knew that the Great Journey was a lie, really had characters that aligned with this kind of melancholic introspection. However, thanks to this incredible art by Shikai Wang in the graphic novel, which was the first new piece of Halo content to release after Halo 2, mind you, we got a very different look at Truth, a look at a completely different side to one that we see in the games. inside, heavily weighed down by his crown and everything that it symbolizes. This art shows that Truth did suffer from an inner conflict about pursuing the great journey and the genocide of humanity despite knowing that the entire cause that backed these things was false, and for this art to release in the first new Halo thing post Halo 2, which of course is where we heard this dialogue, it really made me think that that dialogue could be courtesy of Truth. But then I had a bit of a revelation. Now, yeah, I am going to violate the rule that I just mentioned here about not talking about anything that came beyond the trilogy, but just hear me out, it comes with a little bit of a caveat. So, in Halo Evolutions, that granted released in 2009, there's a story called Wages of Sin. It follows the final hours of the Minister of Discovery, barricaded inside his office in High Charity as the Flood outbreak runs rampant throughout the city. During the story, he laments over the Covenant's various failings over the years, but also reveals that he was in fact one of the very few prophets outside of the three hierarchs who knew that the Great Journey was a lie. Now granted, Destroyer's invocation doesn't play at any point during the Flood's outbreak on High Charity, but it's clearly a track that's anchored to the Holy City given where it plays, which is something we'll come to in a minute, and also given the overall tone and message in the song. It really wouldn't surprise me if Marty and the team intended for this speech to come courtesy of some shameful prophet, and then 343 found that in Bungie's story bible when they took over the franchise, and then decided to create the Minister of Discovery and write Wages of Sin as a sort of subtle expansion of that dialogue. Honestly, I think both characters fit the bill really well.
I have walked among men and angels for 3,000 years.
The Covenant were founded in 800 BC, so roughly 3,000 years ago. This lore was added after Halo 2, but with the rounding error included, it still lines up with this dialogue. Coincidence or not, you can decide. This prophet, truth, or discovery, whichever one you choose, has also existed amongst man, and also with their angels, like Forerunner relics and sentinels and that kind of stuff, for those 3,000 years.
Time has no end, no beginning, no purpose.
This kind of apathetic wallowing is very depressive, which is fitting given the mindsets of both prophets.
I wander the earth, seeking forgiveness for my horrible crimes against God and man.
Earth in this context could just be a metaphor for the galaxy, but if you want to believe that it's Truth speaking here, then you could extrapolate it to be referring to his journey to Earth at the end of Halo 2. And they're seeking forgiveness for their crimes against God, the Foreigners, for exterminating us, humanity, who are their ancestors and inheritors, and for their crimes against man for exactly the same reasons, because remember, at this point in Halo's lore, humans and Foreigners were the same thing, and so we are technically their gods. That's the poetic irony that is completely lost when you retcon humans being Foreigners, but well, that's an entirely different topic for a video that I've already made.
I live to see death, destruction, over the light, but the light cannot be extinguished.
This prophet is either directly or indirectly responsible for the Human Covenant War, which has wrought death, destruction, and evil. But he knows that because man are God's descendants, the human race will not be extinguished.
I live in a prison of my own demise.
Because the human war is their fault, even more so if this is Truth because he's the one who directly ordered it, the metaphorical prison of guilt they now exist in is their own doing.
I am lost in time.
And this just sounds like yet more depressive wallowing. If you do think that these words came from a prophet, then let me know which prophet in particular you think they came from down below in the comments, because from where I'm sat right now, it kind of seems like it could be either. Oh, also, this line of thinking is going to be really important for something else that we're going to be talking about later on, so keep it front of mind because we're going to be coming back to it. But possible answers may lie in details that are far more obvious and frankly in our face. Perhaps the name of the song and the suite that it speaks during are of some matter of importance as well. Mausoleum Suite, which it's a part of, is referring to, of course, the Mausoleum of the Arbiter on High Charity. And Destroyer's invocation means to, quite obviously, invoke a destroyer, and who or what this destroyer is likely holds the key to unraveling this entire mystery. So, with that in mind, let's look at where this track plays. So, Destroyer's invocation plays during the intro to the Arbiter, during the prison section of Gravemind on High Charity, and during the Tartarus boss fight. And what's even more interesting is that the song is actually a partial reprise of Weight of Failure, which is an Arbiter-themed track that plays during the Heretic. So where this track plays very clearly hints at it being themed around the Arbiter. The only exception is the fact that it plays during Gravemind, but not long after it plays, you literally go to the mausoleum of the Arbiter, so that kind of lines up still. So, these Arbiterlings, what the hell do they actually mean? Well, in one of Installation 00's videos on this topic, he had a theory that suggested that this chorus is spoken in unison by the spirits of every fallen Arbiter. Now, yes, I know this sounds insane, because the paranormal is barely ever present in Halo's lore, and the few times that it is present, particularly with Gaeshes and that kind of stuff, it's almost entirely 343 lore that came long after this. But again, just hear me out with this, we're going somewhere.
I have walked among men and angels for 3,000 years.
So as we established earlier, the Covenant formed roughly 3,000 years ago. Now, ignoring the post-Halo 2 lore that confirmed that the role of the Arbiter actually predates the Covenant, this means that in Halo 2's lore at least, the Arbiters have existed alongside humanity and the Foreigners for roughly 3,000 years.
Time has no end, no beginning, no purpose.
The Arbiters are dead. They exist now in a realm where space and time have no meaning, no purpose.
I wander the earth, seeking forgiveness for my horrible crimes against God and man.
The Arbiter itself is a title given to those who have brought great shame to the Covenant, and also their gods, and so they're given the role and sent on suicide missions in a bet to reclaim their honor, and in doing so, seek forgiveness for their crimes against their fellow Covenant and the gods that they worship.
I live to see death and destruction.
Upon becoming an Arbiter, all you witness is death and destruction on your suicide missions until you die, reclaiming your honor.
The light cannot be extinguished.
The adversaries on these suicide missions were seen as ontologically evil, seeking to extinguish the light of the Holy Covenant, but the Arbiters were the ones who ensured that that light could not be extinguished.
I live in a prison of my own demise.
Now this one's interesting because you can interpret it in one of two different ways. Firstly, that the prison is the role of Arbiter itself. So an elite only becomes an Arbiter through immense failure, and in becoming an Arbiter, they shed any title, inheritance, or honor that they once had. They become the Arbiter following the literal demise of their former selves, and then the only way they can be freed from the role of Arbiter is through their literal demise in battle. Or this prison can be interpreted as the caskets that their bodies now reside in, within the mausoleum of the Arbiter. Or, alternatively, just death itself. They only exist in death because they succeeded as an Arbiter and died to regain their honor.
I am lost in time.
Again, another analogy for the plane of existence that their souls now reside in, the afterlife, in which space and time have no meaning. This also lines up with the name of the track. The Arbiters were destroyers who were only ever invoked in times of extraordinary crisis. And further, there's an insane detail that backs this up that Installation 00 pointed out that I never clocked until now, and that's the fact that this dialogue in Destroyer's Invocation is backwards spoken English. And how do the elites talk in Halo Combat Evolved? Yep, backwards spoken English. You know, I almost threw this entire video out when I saw Installation 00's video. The Arbiter theory is just, like, almost perfectly bang on. I mean, it lines up with the lore of 2004 when Halo 2 was written, it lines up with where this track plays, and it also lines up with the actual role of the Arbiter almost perfectly. This video was 7 pixels from the recycling bin. But then, I saw a reply to Marty's comment on my video by the real Akumu. What if the voice is supposed to represent Cain? And thus, we've reached the theory that saved this video. A theory that is so plausible, so logical, and so accurate, and that nobody has talked about yet. What if this dialogue is another one of Bungie's many biblical references in Halo? What if it's an analogy of Cain and Abel from the Book of Genesis? Ever since the video that me and Wendigoon did together last month, the kind of biblical roots of Halo's lore and universe have fascinated me even more so than ever before, and so this rabbit hole that we're about to go down is really down my alley at the moment. So, a brief summary for those who may not know the story of Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel is the story of two of the sons of Adam and Eve. Cain, who was the firstborn, is a farmer, and Abel, the secondborn, is a shepherd. Both sons would routinely make offerings to God from their gardens, and God would look favourably upon the offerings from Abel. However, he would not look favourably upon Cain's offerings. This angered Cain deeply and ultimately caused him to lead Abel out into a field and kill him. In response, God put a curse on Cain, making him a restless wanderer on the earth and banishing him to a land called the Land of Nod, which was said to be east of Eden. In the Land of Nod, Cain's life continued. He had a wife, he had children, he built great cities, and his bloodline continued for many generations to come. But the details after his banishment aren't that important, neither in the actual story of Cain and Abel or for today's topic. Now, clearly, in isolation, this story is brimming with references and similarities to Halo's lore, and don't worry, we're going to get to those later on. But first off, let's just compare Cain and Abel to Destroyer's Invocation from the perspective of Cain.
I have walked among men and angels for 3,000 years.
So obviously Cain walked among men and angels as well. The angel of the Lord is typically a middleman of sorts between man and God, and it's likely who Cain provided his offering to. 3,000 years though is, yeah, granted, a little bit of a sticky detail here. So based on my research, it's kind of loosely assumed that Cain possibly lived around like mid-3000s BC, but as we'll come to, time in the Land of Nod isn't quite the same as on our plane of existence.
Time has no end, no beginning, no purpose.
So the Land of Nod is said to be out from the Lord's presence, which could be interpreted too as meaning a kind of timeless void outside of reality, either literally or metaphorically, because God is believed to be present in all of reality. So his lack of presence implies that this isn't within, at least, space-time as we understand it.
I wander the earth, seeking forgiveness for my horrible crimes against God and man.
God curses Cain to be a restless wanderer on the earth, and you'd hope that in his exile in the Land of Nod, he'd at least try and seek forgiveness for his crimes against Abel, man, and the Lord, God.
I live in a prison of my own demise.
The Land of Nod is his prison that he's been banished to thanks to his actions.
I am lost in time.
And again, this is referring to the fact that because God has no presence in the Land of Nod, time itself has no presence, and thus Cain is lost in a void of time. So, the shoe definitely fits, and given Bungie's penchant for biblical references in Halo's lore and story, I am now of the firm belief that Destroyer's Invocation is a rather cryptic retelling of Cain and Abel. But what really matters is how that story actually fits in with Halo and its story. In the context of Halo, who's Abel, and more importantly, who is Cain, the one actually speaking the dialogue in Destroyer's Invocation? Well, I actually think it's pretty obvious. Cain is the Covenant, and Abel is humanity. Here's why I think that. So Abel was the second-born of the two, a shepherd, the one whose offerings to God were favoured by him, and so was the victim of murder by Cain as a result. Humanity were the second of the two conglomerates to become advanced and spacefaring, are frequently referred to as shepherds in the Bible, were made reclaimers by the foreigners and thus favoured by the gods, and became victims of genocide by the Covenant as a result. And then Cain was the firstborn of the two, was a farmer, was the one whose offerings to God were not favoured, and so was the one who murdered Abel as a result. And the Covenant were the first of the two conglomerates to become advanced and spacefaring, were the ones who farmed the galaxy metaphorically of species to join their hegemony, and also of God's artifacts to collect, were not chosen to become reclaimers, and thus were not favoured by God, and so began a genocide against man as a direct result of this revelation, because man was favoured by the gods and they weren't. The similarities here just line up so perfectly. So, with that said, if the speech is meant to be invoking Cain, the destroyer of his brother, and if Cain in this context is supposed to refer to the Covenant, then who actually within the Covenant is the one speaking these words? Well, I don't know, but quite honestly, I actually don't think the who is really important here, but rather, I think what the dialogue itself actually represents is what matters. Whoever, or whatever is speaking, is of the understanding that the Covenant have acted against their gods in their genocide of humanity, and that in some metaphorical sense have been exiled as a result. If you really want to cling on to the finer details, then that implies that the speaker here is one of the very few members of the Covenant who knows that their religion and this holy war are based upon falsehoods, which of course narrows it down to, well, as far as I can remember, only 4 individuals. The Prophet of Truth, Mercy, Regret, or the Minister of Discovery. And that of course loops back to my earlier theory about this voice either being courtesy of Truth or Bungie's very early and yet to be named version of the Minister of Discovery. It's also worth mentioning the importance of the Land of Nod in the context of Halo as well. It sounds disassociated, but it really isn't. So the Land of Nod was said to be east of Eden, which means east of the Garden of Eden, which of course is where the first 2 humans, Adam and Eve, lived. At the time of Halo 2's writing, it was widely believed among the scientific community that modern humanity originated from Africa. Granted, nowadays it's, I believe, meant to be Turkey that we originated from, or the region that Turkey now is, but back then it was Africa. And so, east of Eden can be equated to east of Africa, which just so happens to be the precise location that the Covenant invaded twice in Halo 2 and Halo 3, and also the location of the Ark portal. It all lines up just way too perfectly, even more so when you remember Bungie's love of biblical references. So, the hidden speech is a reprisal of the story of Cain through the eyes of the Covenant, of whom now face the same exile for the same reasons. Yet another example of time coming full circle. But there's another crucial detail that we haven't talked about yet, a detail that actually I had no idea existed until very recently. It turns out there's actually a second hidden voice in Destroyer's invocation, one that Marty has also left a very cryptic comment about. And it's at this point where I'm going to send you over to Installation 00's video that acts as the second part of this grand conspiracy theory breakdown, where he is going to dive into that second voice, he's going to dive into Marty's very cryptic comment, and a ton more as well in immense detail. The link is on screen and in the description.